Oh, we're just about ready to get started, I think, with the second part of our meeting. And I'm sure that everyone had as good a time as I did in those. You never know what's going to happen. And the connections are really, really wonderful. That's what this is all about. So thank you all for being here, for the sharing in those small groups, and we'll continue sharing as best we can now. So as you know, this is when we get reports from affinity groups and then other projects that are going on. One just overall very exciting is the affinity groups are really growing. And I would certainly encourage people who want to be more involved in this community to, if there's an affinity group that calls out to you, I highly recommend being part of one. It's a way of getting to know people much better because they're generally smaller than this, and they do meet pretty regularly. So you'll be invited to join any you'd like to join. And it's really exciting to watch the momentum as they're growing. So we have 5 affinity groups to hear about today. So the first one, I'll call on Dan Grossman, please, for the contemplative practices and psychedelics. And they've been doing amazing work for, how long have you been going, Dan? Almost 2 years.
Some change, 3 months, year and 3 months.
Yeah. And taken full advantage of doing all this remote by having wonderful speakers. And anyways, I don't want to steal your fire.
Yeah, so I run the contemplative practice group with Ann Dutton. And for those who don't know about it, it's a forum that hosts formal meetings every other month where we talk about some aspect of the intersection of psychedelic research and therapy with contemplative practices. Though the primary focus of the group has been on Buddhist and Vedic inspired practices, we've updated our mission statement recently to be more inclusive of other traditions, in particular, those that are represented in the psychedelic research literature. We recently learned that there's some stuff in the palliative care research that's involving contemplative prayer. So we just want to be open to anything that's happening on the science end. Also, some other updates. We introduced an informal drop-in group, which has been meeting on the off months of our formal meetings. We had one last month and we'll have another one in June probably. And the function of that is kind of just mostly like an extension of our formal meetings. It's a confidential space. We don't record those conversations for people to get to know each other more personally in an unmoderated format. And then the only other thing to announce is that we will be staying online even past the end of COVID restrictions. So if BPRG does return to in-person, we're going to continue hosting our formal meetings online. There are a lot of reasons for that. Key among them being that probably most of our members now are out of state and we have pretty good momentum in this format. So why spoil a good thing? So yeah, that's really all for now. If you want to learn more about the group or be added to our mailing list, just shoot Ann Dutton or I an email and I'll paste the addresses in the group chat. We have our next meeting on the 22nd, which will be led by Helen Van Teen. I think I said your name right. I think she's on here actually.
Yes.
So yeah,
yes.
So just let me know if you want that and I can forward information about that meeting to you and add you to our mailing list.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome, Helen. Nice to have you with us. Also, if you want to be part of any of these groups and you haven't gotten the email, that some of the emails are listed on our website, or you can also always just email Sherry and me at the info@BPRG, and then we can connect you.
You froze for a minute. You may want to say that again.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Did people hear that? And
part of
it. So if you're interested in being in any of these groups, you can go on our website and find people's emails to be in touch with them directly, or just email us at info, and Sherry's putting it up in the chat. Great. Then the Diversity, Outreach, and Inclusion Affinity Group, Mackenzie Bullard is going to give us an update on that. They're doing fabulous work as well.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's great to be here today with you all, and I'm really excited for this conversation we're going to have today, and the speakers that we're hosting. I always like to start these updates off with a sense of gratitude. You know, I think that BPRG has really been, for those that have been involved with the DOI group or have been to our events, have been really influential, I would say, in the sense of creating a space that is calling people in to learn about what we perceive as systemic racism and how it plays out in the field of psychedelic research. And I bring that up today because Marco Ramos, who gave an incredible perspective on the history of ayahuasca and white fear among anthropologists, historians, and now into modern day researchers and the regulatory process of psychedelics and how that's playing out and who's benefiting and who's not, was really powerful. And I encourage all of you to watch his talk and really engage with and listen through the question and answer as something I really aspire to as an aspiring academic. Was when Marco couldn't answer a question, he said he didn't know. And I think that too often in this space, we all, like some of us, of myself included, feel like I should know everything. And that's not true. And especially around these questions about diversity, equity, systemic racism, and all these like kind of hot button topics, it's okay not to know. And I wanted to say that and name that today because we all are in a place of learning. And I think it's really important. So the BPRG DOI group is doing some cool things. We're really trying to distill information. One of the projects we have is distilling information for people to lower the barrier, whether that be into scientific literature and understanding what people are saying, or just guiding people to the right resources on how to get started in psychedelics. So that's one project we're working on. And we're always looking for new people to engage with, new speakers, people to continue the conversation forward on how we can do better, not separately, but together. How can the two worlds of corporadelics and psychedelics, indigenous, all of these fields come together? And that's what our group is focused on. And I think that there are solutions. And I think that that's why I'm grateful to be a part of BPRG. And for the leadership that they provide in the space that they do too. So I'm going to drop my email in the chat. Please watch Marco give his great talk and reach out if you have any questions or want to get involved.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Can you tell us how often you meet, when you meet, how often, please?
Yeah, sure. So we meet once a month. We have a standing meeting, but we are always kind of adjusting that because people like to hang out and talk about history, talk about society, talk about how psychedelics are impacting them. So those meetings during the summer are likely to increase as we're thinking about getting back in person. As Dan had mentioned, thank you for asking me again and about when we meet, because we're going to stay online for the majority of it. But people that are in Boston or people that are otherwise outside of Boston want to get in this hybrid, like meet in a site. And when we meet, we're looking forward to that as well.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Absolutely.
So the next group has had their first meeting. They've been on the list for a while and finally had a meeting that was really wonderful. I was lucky enough to be able to go to that. So I'm going to ask Andrew Essington to tell us about the palliative care and psychedelics affinity group, please.
Thank you so much, Anne. Hi, everyone. We had our first meeting. I would definitely like to give a shout out to Mackenzie for bringing me into the fold for this. He's been a great person to learn from. So we did some general introductions and then talked about potential areas of exploration moving forward. We talked interestingly about both patients facing either palliative or end-of-life situations, but also the potential application of psychedelics in treating healthcare workers in facing burnout or PTSD after the last year, and how psychedelics could be very beneficial for that. Other areas we were looking at exploring is there's sort of this shared space around medical aid in dying. I know there was a ballot proposition in I think that was in 2010, I want to say, and their legislation is moving through the House and Senate in Massachusetts. So that's something we definitely want to keep our eye out on. And then the benefits for psychedelics in treating complex grief, both for after people die, the family and caregivers that are left behind, especially in the year we've had. There's a lot of people who are not able to say goodbye to their loved ones in sort of normal circumstances, whether they weren't able to have funeral services, or they weren't able to gather, they weren't able to be at the bedside for people as they took their last breath. In terms of advocacy and policy that we'd like to be advocating for, it's a priority to make sure that insurance isn't determining sort of who can get this therapy and who can't. We talked about trying to indicate it or integrate it into state insurance and making sure it's covered by Medicaid and not just private insurance, and also looking at compassionate use and expanded access. And then as these substances continue to be decriminalized, what that might mean for someone who is facing a large existential burden and might be interested in going through sort of an unguided session due to the lack of access to that and what the repercussions for that could be. But overall, I'm really excited about this work. That's really what drew me into the field of psychedelics in general, was the studies at Columbia dealing around end-of-life anxiety with psilocybin. And yeah, I'll throw my email in the chat box, and we are planning on meeting on the third Thursday of every month. And so that will be Thursday, May 20th at 7 p.m. And we would love to have you, and I'm very fortunate for this group. So thank you all.
Thank you, Andrew. And a group that is forming, the Integration and Harm Reduction Group for Therapists Only. And Lance Linke is organizing that and is going to give us an update. He announced 2 months ago he was willing to get it going, and it sounds like it's getting going. So thank you, Lance.
Absolutely, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. We plan to convene June 20th at noon. I'm going to put that I'm going to put my email and information about that in the chat. These are two very large topics, and what we're doing, as well as allowing people to access it confidentially. So you can send me emails, you can ask questions, you don't have to participate, just due to the sensitive nature of some of these topics and how different people are kind of integrating themselves with these communities. So we plan to do something that's very pragmatic in terms of answering questions, as well as providing case examples, just to give people a flavor of some of the questions that have been coming in. We want to look at therapeutic modalities such as ACT, seeing if some modalities are more facilitative of integrative experiences than others, for example. Operationalizing inner healing intelligence and how to access that, how these molecules access that, and how to continuously access that throughout daily functioning. These are some of the questions that have been submitted. So we're soliciting additional questions, as well as people that would be interested in providing case examples of anomalous or interesting or curious presentations, client presentations that would help therapists not only be more versed with harm reduction, but also obviously how to integrate these experiences most beneficially. So please feel free to ask any further questions. I'll put the date again in, and we'll be holding this virtually.
Thank you, Lance. And then the last affinity group is just being formed, or maybe isn't even quite being formed yet. And unfortunately, the person who's going to be the leader couldn't be with us, so I'm going to speak for her. Her name is Dr. Amanda Kim. She's a psychiatry resident at the Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston. She reached out to me to see if she might be able to start an affinity group for therapists in training, which I think sounds like a great group to get started. So she's excited to do that. She was working today, so couldn't come and let people know about that. It's the first step will be to be in touch with her, and her email I'll put in the chat. It's Amanda Kim, or you can just be in touch with Sherry and me through the info at the BPRG, and then we'll get you connected with Kim. And if you know people who are in training who might be interested who aren't already in the BPRG, that would be fine too. So great, thank you. So that's for affinity groups, and then we have other. Yes.
Had you wanted Franklin and I to say anything?
Now we have other projects that aren't affinity groups, but are people, eager people like Dick, who are involved in wonderful projects. So first, let me just give a quick update on the CPTR. So for people who are new, though I see a lot of people here are either graduates or in the program, it's the California Institute of Integral Studies, the Center for Psychedelic Therapy and Research, or you get a certificate to be a psychedelic therapist and researcher. At first, I was in the first cohort in 2016, and a year ago at our BPRG meeting, Janice publicly made the offer of bringing a cohort to Boston. And could we do it? It was a good challenge. So here we are a year later, and we've already had our first meeting. And I see some of you here who are part of the cohort, which is exciting. So we met on a weekend in April. It's 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We have 120 people who are based in Boston. They're from all over, but Boston is their home base. And then we have 130 people on the West Coast in San Francisco. Our next weekend is our second meeting, and it will be going through till the end of the year. And yesterday was the graduation from the previous cohort. So we're ramping up to train therapists, as many as we can, very, very aware that we want the quality of this program to stay very high. It's really sort of the gold standard of the training in this field right now, and we don't want to dilute it. So it's an interesting experiment to expand it so quickly this time. I think so far it's okay. So it's good. Then the next program, I'd like to ask James Davis to give us an update on the DCRIM in Massachusetts, which he told us about 2 months ago, and there are some really exciting updates. So thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Anne. Really appreciate you and all the work that the health community is doing to make sure these alternatives are accessible in Massachusetts. It's really exciting in Boston. At the budget priorities meeting last Thursday, we were 95% of the attendees, and people shared personal stories of overcoming alcoholism, opioid addiction, cluster migraines, you name it, by using either microdoses or normal doses of psilocybin and ibogaine. So it's really heating up in Boston. Every weekend, we have volunteers sharing these slips with a simple email tool to contact the Boston City Council. And so far, we've gotten over 400 Bostonians to email them. We've met with 6 counselors and their teams. All of them seem extremely excited about the reform. We just need certain constituencies like the medical community, like our faith communities, to also chime in and start to share their views. There's complicated politics happening in Boston because of the mayoral race. It might not happen until after we know who the next mayor will be after the Democratic primary, but it will absolutely be a huge help to use that simple email tool to just let them know that you don't think BPD should investigate, arrest, or detain people who have possession of psilocybin or any entheogenic plants. I also mentioned that we've been really active in the Black community as well, with some of their strongest organizers around Black Lives Matter, changing the nature of policing, really coming out strong for us with the city council as well. So Boston has a chance to really spotlight how these plans can heal globally. And it's no understatement to say that by just pitching in a little bit to call the council with us at our action hours twice a week, virtual, coming out to leaflet, or even just taking the 10 seconds that the simple email tool takes, you will literally be changing the world in a very big way. Dr. Rosenbaum, the former chief psychiatrist of MGH, has endorsed decriminalization because the stigma that exists around that is preventing a lot of entrepreneurs in Boston from applying for research grants or getting those research grants. If Boston does this, we'll see more federal money freed up. You'll see more people joining your affinity groups. And that's my promise to you, is that all these goals go together, and decriminalization is going to be a very effective strategy in Boston. as it has been in Somerville, Cambridge, and Northampton. East Hampton and Worcester are also on their way. We expect East Hampton to decriminalize this upcoming month. Worcester's a little tougher if people know the political climate there. It's a little more conservative culturally. Not a lot of people actually vote in these mayoral elections, which is a good and bad thing for activists like ourselves. It's bad for democracy, good for smaller interest groups to have their voice heard for good and bad. So your help will really be essential to us, and I just encourage you to reach out to me. We'll also incorporate your ideas into the resolution if you know orgs that deserve a shout out, because we've been doing that with harm reduction groups and across the state as well. I think that pretty much rounds it out. And do you have any questions that I should answer too that might be helpful? Because I feel like I leave stuff out sometimes.
I'm getting a question here from Dick. Would you like to say something, Dick?
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, because I was involved in Dr. Rosenbaum, or Jerry Rosenbaum's endorsement. He is endorsing, and I'm not taking a position on this, I just want to make sure it's clear. He is endorsing that research funds are made available. He and he was speaking in a personal rather than MGH capacity, but also in that capacity was not commenting at all on general decriminalization. I just don't want, I want to make sure that's clear, because I was involved in the conversation, so I don't want to have it misunderstood.
And I appreciate that insider knowledge. He pretty clearly endorses decriminalization in the article I'm referring to, and says it specifically in those terms. So maybe there's some caveat that wasn't included in the Boston Nonprofit Journalism article that we're cited in, but
that'd be great.
I think the point still stands, especially since there are people being arrested by BPD today. We also see in Oregon that racial inequalities in arrests drop an estimated 95% when decriminalization is pursued. So Dick, not to take away from your points at all, thank you for bringing that up. Would love to chat. But that's the article I'm referencing where it sounded pretty explicit to me.
Thank you could you just put a link to that? Could you send me a link to that? I would very much appreciate it. Yeah, and I'm not opposed to decriminalization. I just was concerned Jerry's comments being characterized completely.
For sure. Yeah, I'm not trying to mischaracterize him, I promise.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. Well, that's a good segue to our next report, which is from Dick Simon and Franklin King, who are both very involved with the new center at the Mass General, the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. So I'll turn it over to the two of them. Thank you.
Great. I think what I was going to do is sort of give a broad perspective on kind of where things are going, and then Franklin was going to talk about a few of the actual work, the trials that are being done there, and then there's a closing on a general expanded program. So we did our official launch a couple of months ago, after sort of a year of it wasn't really very silent. We had very well attended webinars, but it's now an officially launched center at Mass General Hospital. Michael Pollan spoke at the launch, and in aggregate over 1,000 people were involved, which was fantastic. There was a tremendous amount of press. NPR picked it up and did a story, the Globe, and as well as a web article, the Boston Globe, and since then it's gone in a lot of different directions, which is really exciting. Internally in the hospital, what I'm thrilled about is there's a lot of momentum internally as well as externally. And Jerry is getting all sorts of requests from all over the hospital for people who have been interested in doing this work, in some cases for a long time, and stayed silent out of a sense like, well, this isn't going to help my career. But now under his leadership and the auspices of the center, it's become something that can be promoted in the mainstream. And then finally, a fellow BPRG member, Lorianne Cibolo, is joining later this month as program director of the center, which I think will that much more help things go forward. And why don't I turn over to Franklin to actually talk about some specifics of what is going on.
Yeah, thanks, Dick. I think I will take this moment to note what Michael Pollan said at our launch event, which was referring to when the two of us had lunch about 4 years ago. And I was saying, I really want to see psychedelic work done at MGH. And he said, I don't see this happening. It's not going to happen at Harvard. It's not going to happen in Boston. You're going to have to move somewhere else, to California or NYU. And he said, I was wrong. He was right. So here we are. A lot of stuff going on, really exciting. I think the main study that's actually quite close now is the rumination study, psilocybin for rumination study. It's going to be the heavy neuroscience study. We're going to be doing imaging of people while they're on psilocybin. So we have the FDA approval for that. It's currently sitting before the IRB. We expect to get approval fairly quickly. The therapists who are going to be on that study include myself, and we're actually in the midst of COMPASS training. We're using a COMPASS protocol for this study, but it's not a COMPASS study. So we're in the middle of therapy training for that. We're going to be wrapped up with the training in about a month. And so we expect that we're probably going to be enrolling sometime in the late summer, early fall, depending on kind of how things shake out with that. There's a second psilocybin study that's probably about 6 months behind this one. It's going to be a cognitive neuroscience study. Again, probably starting sometime in January. And then we also have an MDMA study that I'm going to be running. It's going to be combining MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with a mindfulness-based training protocol. And that's, we expect, probably about a year away. There's a number of other things that are happening, both inside the CNP and without. So we're in, I think we're pretty close to being finished with talks with a private sponsor that is going to fund a neuroscience of psychedelics fellowship for researchers. And not just 1 year, for several years out. So basically establishing an actual special research fellowship in this domain, which is pretty cool. We have some pretty very preliminary talks, but it's worth bringing up that, you know, Dick mentions that all these other people in the hospital are now getting interested in psychedelics. This is kind of outside the CNP, but there's the beginnings of a discussion of potentially using psilocybin to treat cancer-related pain. So we'll see where that goes. And then we have a couple of people who work in the depression and clinical research program, which has a ketamine component, who are very interested in studying ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Now, if you do a study using ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for depression, you have to go to the FDA and you have to get an investigational new drug application. But that doesn't, so that would take a very long time. But what they're thinking of doing, I think they're actually applying for a grant for this, is to basically do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and then retrospectively review the results. So it's not going to be a prospective study, but it's going to be the beginnings of kind of establishing a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy clinic at MGH. I think those are the big things. A lot of sort of like ancillary things and studies at very early stages of proposal. And then I think Dick has a couple of other things to say related to some other initiatives too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, expanding on the ketamine, that in addition to that work that's being done at MGH, and I was impressed with the way you can figure out how to sort of not go through all the additional complexities by doing it as an internal quality improvement study, I believe it is, rather than a study or clinical study. But I am very involved, and MGH will probably be very involved in a multi-site trial. The issue with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and reimbursement that is often heard is there's no hard clinical data that it works or that it's better. You know, there are a few studies out, but they're observational studies and self-reported studies, and there are no like randomized controlled trials that demonstrate, no, here's what happened with group A, here's what happened with group B, similar to what MAPS is doing and USONA and COMPASS and others. So we're working with a number of institutions to create a scaled multi-site trial with randomized control, such that third-party payers will have, well, we'll find out, but hopefully we'll have concrete evidence that this is indeed a valid and better therapy with longer-term effects and the like. So that's it.
One other thing, so we finally picked a date. We've been working towards creating a CME course for psychiatrists, or a conference, and we are going to have a live virtual conference on November 13th on psychedelics as well. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, so welcome back to those of you who are lucky enough to be with us for the breakout rooms and affinity group reports, and welcome anew to those who weren't, but we're really glad to have you. If there's anyone here who is here for the first time and didn't join the BPRG to get the link, I know that Dick sent out an email that people have joined through that, but if at the end of today you're interested in joining the BPRG, please go onto our website and it's really easy to join. So thank you. So today I had the honor, privilege, and delight to pass the baton off to Dick Simon, who's one of my partners in crime, one of the co-founders of the BPRG. He's well known as an entrepreneur, social enterprise philanthropist, and a real catalyst for change. The last couple of years, he's been working almost full-time and then some with his nonstop energy in the field of psychedelic medicine, how to get them legalized. How to get them legalized, and also how to destigmatize them, how to talk more clearly about them in a way that people can hear about them and not be turned off by the name psychedelic. And then recently, he's also been the driving force, I could say but it really is the driving force behind the Mass General's new Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. So he's chair of their advisory board and just making a huge difference there. So I'm very grateful to him today for leading this discussion. Business is not my bailiwick, and it's really nice to have a business person who can lead the discussion. So all yours, Dick. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm thrilled to be here and, honored to be part of BPRG. And one of my favorite things to do is getting to work with Ann on stuff. So this is great. I also want to just clarify, I'm also thrilled to have a role in chairing the advisory council at Mass General Hospital. It's the people in-house there, Jerry and Franklin and the leadership that are really doing, all the heavy lifting, making it happen. But it's fun to be able to be a catalyst and help make things go forward. So today we're joined by three really amazing leaders and entrepreneurs and people who have very different models of care delivery for the potential for psychedelic assisted therapy. And rather than long introductions and the like, people have received their information and they will be presenting. What I'll do is a really quick introduction of each and then turn over to them. And the basic program is each will speak for about 10 minutes or maximum of 10 minutes. And then I'll be asking some questions and then we'll be opening up to questions from everybody else. So first, so we'll do this and then I'll introduce the second. I'll introduce one at a time so that people keep fresh as to. So our first speaker today is Ronan Levy, who's an entrepreneur and a visionary. And significantly in this space, he's co-founder and executive chair of Field Trip Ventures, which is a fascinating company and is focused on the development and care and delivery of psychedelic therapies in several different ways. And with that, Ronan, I turn it over to you. And thank you so much, and thank all of our other speakers so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone. I appreciate it, and thanks for the attention that everyone is giving to bring this segment to life. I think it's really important. So, as Dick noted, at Field Trip, we're focused on the development and delivery of psychedelic therapies. The founders in Field Trip have been very active in the Canadian medical cannabis industry, and I think did a lot to engender the buy-in across the board of medical cannabis in Canada, focused on doing good quality medicine to try and address the stigma associated with cannabis medicine. And after we left the cannabis industry, we started focusing on the psychedelic industry. at first, just given the natural superficial parallels between cannabis and psychedelics. But obviously, we recognize that there's significant differences between the two. With Field Trip, we're operating within two divisions. So we have our Field Trip Health division, which is focused on building the clinical infrastructure that we think is going to be necessary to help deliver psychedelic therapies at scale in the future. Unlike Dr. Steve Mandel, who was speaking just a few minutes ago, we're starting from the perspective of CAP. We believe heavily that the psychotherapy component of it is essential to the therapeutic outcomes. But more so from an innovations perspective, we want to be in a position to be able to innovate around how you deliver the therapy, both in terms of the therapeutic protocols, how you leverage technology, as new molecules get approved, as we see MDMA get approved, as we see psilocybin get approved, as we see other molecules get approved. We think there's a really unique and special opportunity to innovate on how this care is delivered, particularly vis-a-vis the therapy. So with Field Trip Health, we're opening up locations around North America right now. We're operating in Toronto, New York, LA, Chicago, and Atlanta. Houston is opening up next week. Amsterdam, where we'll actually be working with psilocybin truffles as well, is opening in the next couple of, I think in about a month now, actually. And we'll continue to scale, really focused on creating best-in-class standards of what a psychedelic experience should look like. So if you ever have a chance to visit any of our locations or even take a look at our website, you'll see that all of our locations we've invested very heavily into designing beautiful, warm, bright, safe, and inviting spaces where we can help people, a lot of people. Because as we were starting to understand the industry a couple of years ago, the feedback we got from people like Rick Doblin and the folks at Beckley was that clinical infrastructure is what's going to be needed. It's the foundational level, truthfully, to make this all work. And if that doesn't exist, the rest of the emergence of this kind of care is not going to be as elegant as we hope it to be. And so that's where we focused, and that's really what we're doing, leveraging our experience in operational efficiencies in the back end of clinic operations to really bring this and help make it accessible to a much broader audience. At the same time, we are also focused on developing new molecules, new drugs, new psychedelic products, because as wonderful as we see ketamine is, as wonderful as we see MDMA can be, as wonderful as we see psilocybin can be, it doesn't mean that they can't be improved upon. I mean, I think we can all recognize that one of the biggest challenges with psychedelic therapies is the timeframes associated with supporting an experience and the corresponding cost that goes with it. So what we're focused on right now is trying to find new molecules that give all of the upside in terms of the psychopharmacology of psilocybin, but within a compressed time frame. Ideally 2 to 3 hours was what we're focused on. And so with our first molecule, which is known as FT104, which is derived from a known psychedelic molecule that we've enhanced through a bit of chemistry work with a prodrug strategy, we think we've actually landed on something that's really special, because from a subjective experience as well as from an objective binding constant perspective, what we see with FT104 is it looks almost identical to psilocybin, but the trip time is 2 to 3 hours as opposed to 4 to 6 hours. And we think that's really the sweet spot in terms of delivering these therapies, because you can shrink the time frame required to deliver the care while not necessarily impugning the overall therapeutic outcome, at least the hope. That's the hope. So we're in preclinical work with that right now, hope to be in phase 1 by the end of the year. And then based on our likely indication, we hope to be in market sometime around 2026, 2027. So about a year of when we expect Compass Pathways to come to market. So I will stop there and hand it back over to Dick.
Great. Ronan, thank you so much. So many questions have come up, but we're going to go through each speaker first. And
Sure.
So our next presenter is Julie Megler, who's a board certified nurse practitioner in psychiatry and family medicine. And very relevant today is co-founder of Sage Integrative Health, which is an integrative mental health and wellness center in Berkeley, California. They're weaving together allopathic and holistic approaches to health, incorporating psychedelic assisted therapy as it's legal. She's a MAPS certified therapist, and they're looking to do expanded access work using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And her current work focuses on ketamine-assisted therapy. So there's definitely a theme here today. Medication management, somatic therapy, and teaching about psychedelic-assisted therapy. So Julie, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for the introduction, Dick. Yeah, so I'm going to just share a little slideshow presentation. Hopefully this should just take me a second to help walk you guys through. Dick's son Alex kind of gave me a sense of some things that would be good to cover today. So, but I'll keep it brief. There you go. Is this slide in view for everyone? Yep, great. Yeah, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Dick. So Sage Integrative Health, I co-founded with a woman named Genesee Herzberg about 3-4 years ago. And it was really born out of us each being on our own path to working with different modalities, both within allopathic psychotherapy and both being trained Westernly, but then also incorporating holistic approaches into our own health and well-being. And us really wanting to find a place that could offer all those things in unison together while also bringing in legal psychedelic assisted therapy as we could. And so we started working on a small business plan together. I was in the small business class, and we ended up buying a brick and mortar location in Berkeley itself and building the clinic out. And now we have a sister nonprofit organization called Sage Institute. And we've been doing trainings as well as offering services to various individuals. And kind of our backgrounds, Genesee started as an adherence rater for MAPS, and she's a clinical psychologist. And at the same time, I'd been really impacted and lucky, having had gone and participated in workshops with Gabor Mate and traveling through Central and South America and seeing really the healing properties of what psychedelics have to offer. So I think we already did a good little introduction of who Sage is. And so I'm going to kind of just skip through what we do. So as I mentioned, we bring together both allopathic, evidence-based Western approaches along with holistic care. So we offer ketamine-assisted therapy. We do ketamine-assisted therapy trainings. And then starting this summer, we'll be one of the first 10 expanded access sites for MAPS for the rollout of the MDMA for PTSD FDA trials that are happening. So then we also do psychotherapy and psychiatry, naturopathic medicine, acupuncture, massage therapy, body work, nutrition, and herbs. And one of our primary principles also, and why we have everything under one roof, is that we really feel that individualized treatment for each individual is important for each patient. And so we want to make sure that we can collaborate. That was the missing link that both Genesee and I experienced within our own health and wellness journeys, was that it was, once we finally landed on good quality practitioners, having to cross consultation with each other to make sure that our treatment plans were resonant and kind of building on one another was difficult to do. So we wanted to create a place that does that. So our impact and value, and what are the things that are most important to us? I mentioned this integrative approach and individualized treatment plans, as well as for the care team to be able to come together and work with one another. And of course, evidence-based practice. You guys were talking a little bit about destigmatizing the term psychedelics, and it's really critical, I think, at this time in the psychedelic movement to be making sure that, as well as bringing in these integrative modalities, because that really holds the most complete picture for psychedelic-assisted therapy, working with the mind, body, spirit, as well as on the community level, it's just as important to really make sure we're emphasizing the evidence-based clinical work along the way, which is why we're wanting to be involved in the research aspects of all of this as well. And then I really want to emphasize the importance of open praxis. A few years ago, Bob Jesse put out a letter, I'm totally blanking what he called it, but one of the commitments to it was around kind of open praxis and working in collaboration from a business perspective with other clinics that are moving forward. And so that's something that Sage really holds true to their heart, in that We both share information and materials with other up and coming clinics. We've been working on putting together a playbook so that other small clinics that are wanting to figure out the nuts and bolts of the business perspective, how we can help support them in that journey, as well as how do we, rather than create a competitive atmosphere, we help lift each other up. So I'll give the example in the Bay Area, the collection of ketamine clinics. We do a lot of, such as Polaris and Healing Realms and Temenos and a few others. We really pool our resources. We come together and we share legal advice, forms, we do cross consultation, cross referrals with each other, so that we can really be working in reciprocity to one another and in harmony, which is more of an ecosystem approach. No one clinic can do it all on its own and what we're wanting to bring forward. And so how do we really model that ourselves? And then other values that we really hold highly are things, reciprocity. There's a variety of ways to hold that. And so really, how are we giving back to either the lineages and traditions that we're pulling from in our own treatment models, as well as to the elders that came before us, you know, the older therapy community that was part of right before psychedelics went down. And so sometimes right now it looks like Genesee and I'm volunteering directly for those for certain organizations, or help supporting putting together fundraising initiatives for some of those groups. And then with time, as we grow more and more, we'll be looking to dedicate kind of a percentage of our overall profits towards some particular initiatives in solidarity towards reciprocity. And then kind of looking at, you know, we emphasize quality of care over quantity. So enough time with our clients is really important. So I laid out for you guys a basic sense of what our ketamine looks like. In some ways, it's really similar to MAPS's model. So at very minimum, most bare bones, we have the psych intake. We also take, as I said, an assisted therapy approach with ketamine. We have at minimum, though we emphasize to clients that sometimes it really involves much more than 2 preparation sessions. The ketamine session itself incorporates therapy in it, so it's a minimum of 3 hours and a minimum of 2 integration sessions afterwards. Now, pre-COVID, we shifted our model a little bit in that we used to also include that it was a requirement for people to commit to a series of 3 in this order, as well as we brought in a requirement to have at least 3 integrative sessions with one of our holistic providers. And the reason why we did that is because we really want the clients to see that in order to get the results and meeting their goals and the healing that they're wanting, they can't just work on the psychological level. They can't just work on the emotional level. They have to work on the physical level as well. So that's why we incorporated in the integrative treatments, but then also the importance of emphasizing rapport in relationships. So much of what's happening in the psychedelic work is that it's very relational work. There's a lot of repair that people are doing within their attachment relationships, whether that be early childhood or with people in their current lives. And that to do this work well, you need the time. You can't rush trauma healing. You can't rush healing your depression. And you really need this space to build that rapport and that container so that the client themselves can feel vulnerable enough to really dive deeply into that healing journey that you're hopefully midwifing them through. So then also speaking a little bit about accessibility and sustainability. So accessibility, how do we get out to larger populations of individuals? So we tried a bunch of different models at Sage. One of the reasons why we wanted to get up and going with ketamine-assisted therapy before bringing in the MDMA work was so that we could try out different models as the rollout in psychedelics was happening more quickly. So we tried sliding scale and fundraising for lower income clients. And with time, that became complicated. We realized that was hard to do in the space. It feels risky to investors. People don't want to necessarily donate much money towards that. And so that was how Sage Institute was born. It allowed us to create a nonprofit organization so that we could accept donations and start offering services to more marginalized communities. And we do that by having interns, those that are working towards their psychotherapy licensure, working with the clients while also getting education and didactic around key issues of psychedelic assisted therapy, social justice, as well as depth psychotherapy. So that was one of our solutions there. And then Sage Institute and Sage Integrative Health are collaborating together on doing more public trainings for clinicians, licensed clinicians as well. And then we're also working with organizations such as Inthea. I think you guys, most people here have heard of them as well. Leah Mix's organization to try to work towards finding insurance solutions within this space. And then sustainability in terms of our business model. I think that's a whole conversation, and maybe that's how the Q&A will go into parts of it. But you know, one of the things is that our profit margins are pretty low. We're really focused on patient care and making sure that our clinicians are being paid well for their time, while also covering our overhead. And then we've also been thinking through different alternative ownership models. And that speaks, I think, also to part of the ethos of collaborations and being non-competitive, so that we can be bringing in alternative economy and ownership models into the psychedelic space, which is, I think, important to be considering as well. And so we worked with Purpose Economy to think through some of these models. In the state of California, it's a little bit complicated because you have to have a professional or corporation. And as a professional corporation, you actually can't take external investment with that unless that person's a clinician themselves. So then we started thinking about creating an MSO, which is we've been working in collaboration a bit with Fourth Road and Greg Kearns to think about how to be offering, you know, all the startup services as well for clinics to be able to get going, and also be thinking through some of these alternative models. So that's the, I feel like I kind of ran through most of that, but if you're curious to learn more about Sage, leave up here for a moment how to sign up for our newsletter, Instagram, and then also just wanted to put the word out that we are looking to hire some additional psychotherapists that are licensed in the state of California specifically, who already have previous training and experience in ketamine assisted therapy. So I'll leave it there, and hold on, I'll turn off my screen share. And I look forward to the Q&A and getting to know both of you guys from Synthesis and Field Trip a little bit better.
Great. Well, Julie, thank you so much. Again, lots of questions, and we'll get to them in just a few, like 10 minutes or so, because we're honored to be joined today by Miles Katz, who's co-founder and director of business development at Synthesis, which is offering psilocybin-based therapy at retreat center in the Netherlands, and is looking at expansion plans that they'll be talking about shortly. Miles has been instrumental in developing infrastructure and financing for one of the world's first legal psychedelic experience service models. And in doing so, he's at the forefront of a worldwide movement to transform the way people approach emotional, cognitive, and spiritual well-being through the safe and legal psilocybin experiences. It's all yours.
Thanks, Dick. And yeah, thanks to Ronan and Julie as well. Really happy to be here. I'm also a Northeastern alum, so I'm happy to draw some ties back into Boston. I'm going to share my screen and walk through a little presentation, because that is always helpful to keep me focused. So as Dick mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders and director of business development at Synthesis Institute. We run legal, professionally facilitated, medically supervised psilocybin truffle retreats in the Netherlands. And we've also launched a practitioner training program recently, but I'll focus more on the retreats just because, as I understand it, that's the focus of today's presentation. Say, like, to just kick us off, like, one of the questions and visions we really had when we started Synthesis at the end of 2017, early 2018 was knowing that this research renaissance was well underway and that psychedelics were kind of on the horizon. We wanted to think about what was the ideal delivery model for psychedelics in the long-term future, 10, 20, 30 years from now, however long it might be, when psychedelics are not only legal, but really integrated into modern society. What are these spaces going to look like? What is the education that clients will need, psychospiritual education, education in expanded states, as well as how do you really foster and build a community around these experiences to make them really long-term transformational? And so in the Netherlands, because psilocybin truffles are available virtually unregulated, they actually end up being regulated under food law. We have the ability to start working on that and building that model, and knowing that as time rolls on and jurisdictions evolve, we'll be able to take what we learn and kind of share it with others. So the name synthesis really comes from this desire to blend some best practices that we can observe from the ancient traditional use of psychoactive plant medicines, things like working in a multi-day immersive setting, things like working in groups, things like combining the plant medicine with different rituals around breath work or meditations, in addition to what we're actively learning from the modern science and research of psychedelics. And I'd say there's a few things that when we started really helped to set us on a certain trajectory, because I believe overwhelmingly psychedelic retreats are not seen as part of the modern renaissance of psychedelics, or they're kind of kept with a bit of a distance. But I feel like Synthesis has done an all right job of kind of fitting in and being part of what's going on. And I think there's a few main reasons for that. One is that we've always been super strict about who we allow as clients in our retreats. So we reject roughly half the people who apply because of things like depression or addiction. And it's definitely not because we don't believe psychedelics can help this, but it's because we really want to be in full integrity with our work. And we're, especially when we set up, but still even today, we're not a full clinical site. So there's just limitations in that. We've also always been focused on partnerships and collaboration. From the very first group of clients that we hosted as a pilot site, we were contributing data to the Imperial College of London, who outside of their clinical work also does kind of survey-based naturalistic setting studies on psychedelics. And lastly, we really wanted to focus on not just this idea of what's possible in a before and after sense of psychedelics, but what does it look like to really incorporate psychedelics and other expanded states of consciousness into your life in a way that you can come back to these expanded states on a regular basis and really embody this long-term transformational journey that life is, and use these states to help grow and evolve and heal on a continuous basis. So I have this really grossly oversimplified model for how we view the psychedelic ecosystem and how we view our role within it. So apologies for how simplified it is, but hopefully you see why I'm using it as I share it. Most of the time and energy and money and resources is really being poured into this medicalization of psychedelics. So it's like hugely instrumental work. It's very capital and time intensive. People like MAPS and USONA and Compass really paving the way for clinical trials and approval. However, one of the limiting factors of the medicalization of psychedelics will be that you can only access a psychedelic medicine if you have the diagnosis. And so diagnosis treatment with psychedelics, and that is hugely important, huge amounts of suffering to be addressed, but ultimately limiting, we believe, in the scope of how psychedelics can be used to really see people not just no longer suffer, but eventually move to a place of flourishing and evolving. On the other side of this very oversimplified spectrum is the underground. And just for the sake of the point, I kind of lump everything illicit in the underground ayahuasca, Burning Man, tripping with your friends in the woods. And this is where like 99.99% of people are experiencing psychedelics today because there's not a lot of legal avenues. And so there is a lot of really positive outcomes that can come for this, but because of the illegal nature, there's also a lot of risks. There's substance risk. There's, in a worst case scenario, underground practitioners being unethical or doing bad things. And largely these groups don't really want to be regulated. They don't want to be told how to use psychedelics, and that's okay, but it's going to be limiting in how we think about integrating psychedelics into society, because we really want to see them, be adopted and flourish. And so where we see our work in the world and how we kind of navigate is what we refer to as transformational wellness. It's working in places where it's legal to do so, and we work up to the safety and best practice standards of medical psychedelics. However, we intentionally work outside of a medical regulated model, because it really allows us to innovate on how we deliver services. We can work in groups, we can work in a multi-day retreat setting, we can use lots of other modalities alongside the psychedelics and incorporate lots of nature connectedness. And so it's really truly not to say that this is a better way. I think like all these ways have their roles, decrim as well as part of underground, but yeah, just kind of standing for something a little bit more unique and possibly a little bit of a longer tail of integration of psychedelics into society. So I just have a series of pictures of what our retreats look like so people can get a sense. This is a venue we were using in the Netherlands before COVID. It's an old church that had been converted into this like modern Zen yoga center. So you can see like very aesthetically pleasing, a lot of natural elements. This venue had a sauna. So this is like a really nice example of how other modalities of healing, relaxation can be paired together with the psychedelic experience to help people really relax and get the most out of it. This is a little picture of a group circle. So we do lots of workshops before and after the ceremony, help people get to know each other, get to know the facilitators, get pieces of education that can be helpful before or after. Ultimately, like a lot of activities that are just part of container building. So really making people feel safe, feel supported, open up to become vulnerable. And these are ways that we believe people can get the most out of these experiences. And here's a mock photo, a staged photo of what a ceremony at Synthesis might look like. You can see people laying on mattresses, wearing eye masks, blankets and pillows, very comfortable. That part looks very similar to what we see in clinical research settings. However, you can also see we're incorporating elements of more traditional ceremonial use, different sound tools like sound bowls and gongs, and this altar in the middle with flowers and a bit of natural touch. And so everyone is very much having their own experience underneath the eye mask, letting that unfold. However, the context of doing it in a group and kind of sharing this really raw humanistic experience of healing and connection also is a kind of a cornerstone of how we see our work. A little bit of numbers. These are all pre-COVID. We had about 3,000 applications. We ran for about 18 months full-time after our pilot programs until COVID put pause on those. So we had about 3,000 applications, of which we were able to host about 750 participants in roughly 50 groups. So that's a group size of about 15. And I say zero incidents. I always get this question. We are just considering incidents medical emergencies. We actually have emergency medical staff on hand for the psilocybin days, but that's really a precautionary measure, I think, because we're so thoughtful on screening and the container that we build. Thankfully, that's never needed to be used. Here's a little bit of data that's come up from this relationship we have with Imperial College of London from our clients. We had 300 Synthesis clients participate in a naturalistic survey data. So it's not clinical data, so there's lots of gaps there. But I think what this points to is that we can see that there could be a role for psychedelics outside of a medical model. And even some areas we might see certain improvements over what's seen in medical research. For example, this feeling of connectedness that was pointed to in this research really was highlighted by the relationships that people feel like they developed over the course of a 3 or 5 day retreat at Synthesis. And that is probably something the medical model is quite a far time away from being able to replicate. I'll just end, this is my last slide, a couple notes on where we're focusing today. We have primarily worked with wellness populations, but we're starting to explore how we can work with more vulnerable populations, such as people with depression, and how we can build a container for before and after support that meets their needs. We're also very enthusiastic about what's going on in Oregon. I actually relocated to Oregon last year to support that. And the reason being is that the measure that's implementing in Oregon is specifically not for medical only use. They define access to psilocybin as anyone who can demonstrate benefit. And that's like very aligned with how we see the work in the world. I mentioned that we also started a practitioner training. So we have about 60 people in the first cohort that recently launched. This training program includes people coming to the Netherlands. It's mostly digital, but it includes people coming to the Netherlands, getting self-experience with psilocybin, which we feel is very important to do the work. And also we'll be inviting people after they complete the academic part to come back as assistants in our retreats alongside our staff, so they can get that experiential component as well. And we believe that this training program will be able to be adopted to eventually meet the needs of the Oregon licensing system for facilitators, which is in the process of being discussed at the state level today. And a little bit, Julie touched a little bit on this, so yeah, I'm happy we're aligned, is that we're really deeply thinking about how do we make our work with psychedelics in the world not just replacing one pill for another in a broken system, but really helping to evolve the system as we evolve ourselves. And we're looking at, we're likely going to be making some changes in governance structure that kind of cement mission and values over profit alone, not to demonize profit. There's a huge role profit can play with returning money to investors and being sustainable, but yeah, not to be operating in service of profit. And lastly, really focusing on learning what we learn as a first mover, and all the, which can be quite intensive and a little painful and resource capital requirements, and creating ways that we can support other people to go back into their own communities and create their own centers and not have to reproduce all the work that we've done, or all the first movers everyone on this call will have to do. That's really how we think we'll have the biggest impact in the world. So that's my little 10-minute. Here's a couple of our websites and my email address. Just wanted to put that out there, but looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. Well, Miles, thank you so much. And Ronan and Julie, thank you so much. So some questions. So we'll start with, I've got a few questions that I'd love to share. And then I'd like to invite everyone in the audience. It will work best, just because there's 78 people online right now. There are going to be too many cross questions. So please submit questions, if you would, via the chat box. Let's see if we can make that work so that we're not seeing a lot of, taking 30 seconds to figure out who is speaking so people don't overtalk each other. So first question that I've got really is, so you've got on the one hand, MAPS and Compass and USONA and our FDA that is saying that you need 2 therapists in the room, that it has to be 2-on-1, that one of them has to be either an MD or a PhD, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other hand, we're seeing group administration, we're seeing the possibility of working with trainees, and I guess I'm trying to get each of you to comment, if you would, since this is really about the human part of the therapy. What's really needed, and what changes as you are dealing with those with a diagnosed DSM-5 condition versus those who are looking at wellness betterment? And I'll let you take it in whatever order.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak a little bit about our experience with that. We really set out from the beginning not to treat depression or diagnoses. But what we learned very quickly, we have a very thorough medical screening process that largely just rejects people, but these substances and these expanded states really do unearth trauma that people may not even realize they have. And so something that we learned very quickly is that even though we're not advertising or attracting, or not intentionally attracting people with deep-rooted trauma that needs healing, we really needed to build the container to support that anyway. So we have about 1 to 2 staff to participant ratio, very hands-on. The staff are doing about 12 hours a day each day of the retreat. There's lots of elements even outside of the ceremony itself. So just something to note is that even though we're saying that we don't touch this, it comes up in ceremony. People are either lying or they don't know, and they're really desperate looking for help. That's really attracting a lot of people when they read the headlines that are going on. So I think it's a really important question. The way we hold it is that certain populations will need certain support before and after, and maybe even during. And I'd say it's one reason why we're being really mindful about how we start to tiptoe into a medical, or what can be seen as a medical approach to using psychedelics.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm happy to. No, please,
Go ahead,
please,
Ryan.
Julie, go ahead. No, I'm happy to defer to you because I don't have a good answer.
Okay, fair enough. Speaking specifically to the therapy model in terms of having therapy pairs and what the experience level is, I think it really depends on the medicine that you're working with and what's going on for the client. So I'm going to speak more from a patient perspective because that's what SAGE is focused on. I have been involved in some of the conversations with the decrim movements, but there's a whole other side of me that exists there too. But I'm going to focus more on the clinical side for the purposes of this talk. And so, there's all sorts of things that come out and where it can be really helpful to have a co-therapy team there. It's very exhausting work for the therapist itself, or the clinician itself. So say a 3-hour ketamine-assisted therapy session is very different than an MDMA session that could take anywhere from 4 to 8 hours long, or a psilocybin session, in which case I think for the longevity of the therapist itself, having 2 people in the room is really important in creating a good sustainable container so that we're not repeating this kind of burnout mentality that can exist within the clinical professional world. And then it also depends on what the client's working on. When we're working in nuanced spaces and we're working with transference and countertransference, and you're working with various attachment styles, what can be offered to the client therapeutically, and having a therapist pair is really important, so that if, say, they're having projections onto one of the therapists in the room, that you can make the space to really let them play that out. Annie and Michael do a great job of talking about that in their trainings and mid-offers for the MDMA work, so that there's times where projections need to come out, and one therapist is taking a back seat, and then the other one can kind of be the good parent or whatever it may be. So I think it's very nuanced, and it's not a very simple answer, and there becomes a complexity of cost efficiency if you're working with a therapy pair. So it's not a necessity all the time, but I think it can be very healing for people in the right context. So
Great, thank you.
I'm still on the line, even though my camera may have dropped off because my internet just decided to back out on me. But the answer that we have is an incomplete one, which is we're exploring. I mean, we understand the contemplation and considerations that go into having a pair of therapists present. We understand the importance of it, but we also understand the importance of finding a way to make these therapies accessible to more people. And so one of, I think, the unique opportunities that we have with Failed Trip will be just by virtue of the scale that I think we'll be able to achieve. We'll have the opportunity to innovate as much as possible and really bring a lot of objective analysis to the consideration. Right now, at least with our ketamine-assisted therapy, every session is done with a therapist present. We're just innovating on some group models and are exploring potentially enabling people to have ketamine-assisted sessions without a therapist present, self-guided. The place we're in is that we're trying to learn and understand and realize that there's a number of different dynamics involved in the analysis, and we'll continue to explore, trying to learn as much as possible as we go.
Great, thank you. Another area question, this is using a 4-letter word of cost. What does someone on average pay to participate in the therapies that each of you is offering, and sort of what are they, I don't mean what are they getting in terms of value, I mean, what are they getting in terms of, does it include lodging? Does it include, dependent on situation? Well, what does it cost someone to participate?
Also happy to go first. Maybe it's a sequence we silently agreed on. So Synthesis is mostly has run 3- and 5-day retreats, and we price those at roughly $1,000 a day. So it's all inclusive of everything. Once you get to the airport in Amsterdam, we actually pick people up from the airport, accommodation, food, that whole model. And that seems to be a price that we're comfortable we can eventually make sustainable for the business. we're not there yet. There's a lot of overhead and setup to get the first center up and running that we expect to be able to spread over multiple centers over time. It's definitely cost prohibitive. We're deeply acknowledging of that. And so I think like where we're at with this journey is really not trying to cut corners in delivering service, because we do think one of the roles we want to play in the developing ecosystem is to stand for what's possible. Dick, I was thinking about the last question a little more, and really like it's maybe saying what's needed isn't necessarily the right question, but what's possible, what's the most that you can get from a transformational value from these experiences, and that we really want to stand for the deeper side of transformation, which often involves more care, more other services, this container that helps people feel like they've retreated from their everyday life, that causes them a lot of stress and pressure, and they're feeling safe in this new environment. And so we've been working on models where we can get sponsorship. We actually have 10 out of the 60 students in our training program have been paid for by a sponsor who's paid for that, and that allowed us to create more access. So big question. I know people here in Oregon are also very focused on making things accessible. And I think there's some really direct trade-offs that we have to think about in quality of service and cost, and ultimately look for the right way for people to pay for that. But yeah, that's how we've priced our programs to date and what they offer.
Thank you.
I'll hop in. Dick, yeah, I think you just let me back in. Thank you. Continue. Sorry, I'm just trying to rejoin the conversation on Zoom. At Field Trip right now, what we offer is treatments in modules. So the first module, which involves, hold on, sorry, I'm just getting challenges with Zoom. The first module involves the psychiatric screening as well as a medical screening. So we want to make sure that our ketamine assisted therapy programs are both appropriate from a mental health perspective as well as a physical health perspective. It involves 2 ketamine assisted therapy sessions, 2 exploratory therapy sessions, which are an opportunity immediately after the ketamine session for the person to share any insights, emotions, memories that came up, and then 1 integration session. So 1 focused exclusively on cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, typically motivational interviewing or behavioral activation. And that happens after the 2 ketamine exploratory sessions, and that's $2,000. And then each subsequent module, which would be the same without the psychiatric or medical screening, is $1,750 approximately. So typical course of treatment, if we look at 6 sessions, which is what's typically recommended for a person suffering with depression, is about $5,000 to $6,000. As I mentioned, we are in the process of launching a group program, which will cut those costs in half. And then as we start to expand our service models to people maybe with less severe mental health challenges, dysthymia, adjustment disorder, there'll be an opportunity potentially to do some degree of self-guided work, and the cost will further come down from there, but that's still in the planning stages, so I can't offer much commentary on that right now.
Thanks. Great. And Julie, did you have a comment also?
I was just going to say our pricing sounds pretty similar to Field Trips in that we have the intake, and then we do 2 prep sessions, and then the ketamine session, and then 2 integration sessions, and that's about 8 clinical hours, and that's about $2,000. When we do the whole series of 3 with the integrative treatment modalities, meaning massage, nutrition, or acupuncture along with it, we were selling that at a package for about, I think it was $4,900 when we were doing that at that point. And then we do try our best. There are certain billing codes that can be used for people with PPOs to get some amount insurance reimbursements. We do provide super bills for people to get varying amounts of percent reimbursement for the treatment for things that we can bill for. And then there's, of course, also Sage Institute, our sister organization, in which case the person's working with an intern who's being clinically supervised, and the fee for the sessions, for the prep and integration sessions, are anywhere from $20 to I think $130 a session. and similar sort of sliding scale range for the actual ketamine session itself.
So starting with the, one needs to be paid and make profit and make sustainable, and and in other industries you've seen, classic example saying being Tesla, where their first roadster was like $150,000 or $180,000, and sold a lot in Silicon Valley, and now they've got a Model 3 that is still not an inexpensive car, but is much more of a available to a much larger market car. So I'm not challenging any of the pricing, but I'm asking a question. What is the probability of being able to, most people could not afford any medical care, forget about ketamine or psilocybin, any medical care, if they didn't have some insurance for it. Not everyone, but most people. So the key piece here seems to be, how do you get third-party payers paying? How do you demonstrate that, no, this is a valuable, either because it's a valuable therapy for those who are, for those who are with a diagnosed mental health condition, I understand, but how do even they get covered in a way that makes sense and fits in with the rest of the system? If you have diabetes, it's covered. Even if with a number of other, if you need certain other mental health treatments, it's covered. How do we incorporate this work in a way that it becomes truly accessible, not dependent on donors like supporting 10 people, which is great, which is wonderful, and which absolutely should be done, but it's not transformative. The transformation becomes when Medicare, Medicaid, in the US now, Medicare, Medicaid, all these third-party payers recognize that, no, this is just like a mental health issue that for those who have mental health disorders. Any thoughts or comments on that? Where are we on that?
I mean, that's the million, if not billion-dollar question, right? That I think everyone's struggling with.
Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar question.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it is a collaborative effort. I think everybody participating in this conversation is doing something towards it. I think Miles and Julie and myself and Field Trip is doing something about it. From our perspective, our approach has always been to try to work with the existing context of the medical model that exists right now and keep nudging it, towards a more psychedelic perspective, as opposed to starting from outside the model and trying to push that into the current paradigm. And so how do we do that? Well, we generate data. We've issued our first white paper, which I'd be happy to share with everybody, about the first cohort of patients, which shows incredible results. We are very, very active in trying to create awareness around the conversation. We built our brand in a very non-medical context to create awareness and excitement and dialogue to make it a mainstream conversation. And, from my perspective, right now, it's just a matter of keeping our head down, showing great work, showing great results, letting the data speak for itself, and then being proactive in engagement with insurers, which we are actively undertaking right now. I mean, we're fortunate that depression and anxiety are going to become the leading global burden of disease in the next year. I don't know if I call that fortunate, but at least for this particular conversation, we're fortunate that that's such a big problem. And so much of that burden results from lost productivity and missed days of work. So it becomes a conversation that payers should get very comfortable with, or employers should get very comfortable with, because it's actually very good from their perspective. So it's really all of these efforts, but I think it will get there, and I think it'll happen relatively quickly, and certainly with MAPS and MDMA assisted therapy approvals, on the horizon and not too far out, that is going to certainly amplify these efforts as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that, which is I'm in total agreement. I think data is really what we need, and the more clinics that are getting involved in collecting data and sharing data, the more that we can start publishing more papers and getting that out and leveraging that with insurance companies so that we can negotiate for more contracts. One of the things that I just want to acknowledge that's a little bit interesting and contradictory about data collection right now, when you talk to people in the psychedelic space, is that, one of the primary fears is for this psychedelic industry to turn into an industry and fall into kind of big pharma approaches and mentalities. And so there's a big concern around patient privacy around the data collection and how that data and information is being used and whether or not it's going to be used to capitalize versus actually help with their reimbursement. And so just name that, is that being something that's really delicate in this space, and I think really delicate for people who are wanting to experience psychedelics as well. And so how do we not only look at all the issues of how do we not only pool the data, but how do we also hold the issues around privacy and how the data collection can also be misused?
So concern about data privacy.
Well, privacy and how it's being manipulated. So whether or not there's transparency in what the data is actually being used for. Is it really just being used for clinical research, or is it also being used to increase profit margins in some sort of way? So how is it being manipulated potentially? And again, kind of not being an anti-profit person, because obviously that's a required means for moving things forward and for businesses to grow and be sustainable. I'm just naming the various areas in which we need to be aware of not kind of falling back into old paradigms that take advantage of various populations. So.
Great. So I want to let people know that we are now in the audience Q&A. Some of these are like filtered in and being asked from people. So I'm going to keep going here, but please, if you have questions, please send them to me. Probably easiest direct message me in the chat function. So two things. One, I just wanted to. Someone pointed out something there that the Tesla model that I mentioned did two things. It enabled, which may be very well part of what you are doing. It both enabled them to sort of support the initial work that had to be done before they figured out how to deliver a car at closer to mass market levels. It's not at the bottom, but mass market. But the second thing that it did, which the three of you may be doing in very different ways, is it opened up the space. Now there's no major auto manufacturer that isn't exploring or delivering electronic vehicles or electric vehicles. So, rather than viewing the cost question as a challenge, it was more sincerely a question, and then how do we expand it? So ketamine versus other substances. So we're hearing about ketamine, we're hearing about psilocybin, we're hearing about expanded access with MDMA. Is there, some people view ketamine as a stopgap measure. Well, it's legal today, so you can do it. It doesn't have the same emotional component. It's not as long an experience. And then others, on the other hand, view it as a very valid therapy that will be here long after MDMA and psilocybin and others are there, because it has a much shorter duration, which makes it that much more potentially cost effective if you're able to deliver comparable benefits. People don't have to get off their other medicines, which is for many suffering a huge issue, and others. So kind of, I'd love to hear from each of you, or anybody who wants to comment, sort of, where does ketamine potentially fit into this longer term?
I'll share a little bit. We don't work with ketamine at Synthesis, but we've thought about it long and hard. And I'd say, Dick, I think I agree, like this role that ketamine can play in helping people get off their other medication to also help prepare them for experiences that might be intrinsically a bit more deeper and a bit more emotionally, stirring up the pot. Really helpful, and we think there's a big role for it to play in the future with that. Also, the cost of it, and really not looking at this like there's only a diagnosis treatment, but there's this long-term, how do we help society not just not suffer, but really flourish and function? And I think if you think of it in this longer-term approach, there's definitely many roles that ketamine can play as part of that.
You're muted. Ronan, you're not audible.
Thank you. Apologies. I came into the psychedelic renaissance very much viewing ketamine as a stopgap. To be quite honest, I came into the cannabis industry pretty agnostic as to whether cannabis could be used therapeutically as a medicine. And in both instances, I've very quickly come to the place that both of them have very important roles to play. I mean, I think we just have to take a look at the underground psychedelic movement right now, which is people use psilocybin, they use MDMA, they use DMT, they use ketamine. People triage through because all of these, and I'm going to speak at it from an experience perspective as opposed to a neurochemistry perspective, all of these experiences open people up to different insights. And so what we're seeing in our clinics right now in Field Trip is that ketamine is life-changing for a lot of people. And it's wonderful. And you don't need to go more intense potentially or longer term or more expensive to have really meaningful breakthroughs for people. So I look at it as a future where all of these molecules can be triaged, you know, and they're going to have different needs and different purposes at different times for different peoples. And that's wonderful. It just makes it a much more open, fluid, dynamic opportunity to help people. And so I think ketamine continues to have a very significant role, not least of which is because, you know, it is definitely an easier onboarding because if you're on more conventional antidepressants, you know, you don't necessarily have to get off. But I just think it's one more weapon in the arsenal, to use an overused military reference in this context.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say is different receptors for different people for different stages of life. And so how do we keep that open for different opportunities? I was a total, I was kind of anti-ketamine. I wasn't that curious about it. And then as I did training with the Kriya Institute and became more interested in it, I learned a lot in a couple of areas that I would just want to highlight where I see ketamine specifically useful compared to, say, psilocybin or MDMA, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, Dick, are, for instance, for individuals who are suffering with autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, or immunocompromised in some sort of way, working with both MDMA as well as things that are more tryptamine oriented can either flare up symptoms or just not really be an option because they can make their systems too vulnerable afterwards. Say MDMA, for instance, impacts the immune system. Autoimmune disorders can get triggered by the amphetamine aspects of it. When it comes to chronic pain, sometimes for the tryptamine, such as psilocybin mushrooms, which people with all those conditions struggle with, they can often kind of get locked down into the pain experience and kind of working through that in order to actually work with the kind of more transcendent spaces can be difficult. And ketamine's really gentle on the system in a lot of ways. It has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties. So for people who otherwise might not be able to access these altered states, ketamine provides a new opportunity for that as well. And then I think there's a lot of nuances to trauma work. And that's like, I could spend an entire afternoon speaking about that, but where MDMA is really useful for particular parts of trauma, in particular when people are ready to do some of the more cognitive processing around trauma, that's great. However, for some individuals, their nervous systems are still so agitated in that state of hypervigilance that the amphetamine in MDMA can actually activate their nervous system. So there's certain doses of ketamine for particular types of trauma where I think it can really get in there and be useful for trauma work in a way that's unique and very different than MDMA. So those are kind of how I would break it down.
Thank you. Thank you all. There was a specific question for Miles. The 10% number that you cited seemed, well, to the person asking the question, that well-being was only increased by 10%. And I was curious about that myself, and I suspect others are. I would have guessed that to be a different number.
Like a higher number. Yeah. These are just like kind of preliminary results. You know, we kind of assume that a population that's coming to synthesis is already a little bit more open, a little bit more high functioning than a standard population, just because they are of the mindset that I'm, you know, reading and learning about psychedelics and seeking out these services. So I think there could be a number of factors to that. You know, also, you know, it's like these are 4-week data points compared to what really is like this. It largely depends on what people do when they go home and what do they take from their insights and how do they incorporate that into their lives. And so Yeah, I'd say like I also seem to think that could be a little low, but it's just part of this larger narrative of like really truly being open and learning how to improve as opposed to like optimizing for any specific outcome in the services.
Got it. Thanks. So you're presented with this daunting magnitude of the mental health crisis. Is there, what's the biggest barriers that you see to this work being done at scale? And this work can be, what each of the three of you is doing, or just in general psychedelics having an impact on mental health crisis, putting it mildly. That's what we had before. We had, a COVID year, or for whatever, year plus. What's the obstacle? Again, Ronan, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Because I'm on through my phone, I don't see that I'm on mute on the computer. From my perspective, it's twofold. One, its cost is significant, as we've touched on as well, so I won't belabor that any further. The other thing that we're seeing is, and Julie touched on this, which is it is an intense undertaking for a therapist to take people through these experiences, and just the labor associated with that and the time associated with that is a massive challenge to provide the necessary supports. And it was something, our eyes were open to very quickly at Field Trip. We thought, 8 hours in a day, an hour per session, you can kind of do the math, and we were far, far off on that assumption. And so having enough staff equipped to do this, or in lieu of that, and I know this is something that generates a lot of concern, is like, how do you leverage technology to replace some of that human labor or complement it so it's not such a massive undertaking on the individual? These are, to me, those are the two big things. I think the stigma goes away as the evidence continues to manifest itself and demonstrate the safety and efficacy of it. I think the interest level is going to be very high. So the challenges in my mind are really operational in terms of how do you do this affordably and not burn through therapists and create their own challenges by helping enough people at the same time to do this profitably.
Yeah, I have some thoughts there too, especially from the practitioner side. I think we've already named some of the roadblocks around insurance reimbursement and accessibility. One of the huge bottlenecks that I see is in training. There are a lot of training programs out there, but I pretty firmly hold, and I know this is a pretty risky thing to say, and sometimes a lot of clinicians will refrain from saying it, but I do think that personal experience is important. There's a saying that I heard once a long time ago, which is that you can only really take others as far as you've taken yourself. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a ton of personal psychedelic experience and work, but there needs to be some level of knowing the terrain that the people are going to be working through themselves, that I think is absolutely critical. And so then one of the biggest barriers that we run into is twofold. One, enough training programs and people having the experience themselves as part of the training is difficult, and for clear legal reasons. And then the other piece being another barrier to care there is that within itself brings forward some of the kind of more systemic racism pieces too, in terms of reaching out to marginalized populations, because part of the problem with the drug war is that it is such a place of privilege to be able to even be curious about psychedelics as being a white-bodied individual, right? And so really what we need to do in terms of recruitment is being able to train more therapists and therapists of color so that they can work with patients of color or other BIPOC communities, and that the fear, because they've been targeted more heavily by the drug war itself, still is very much a real thing. And so how do we help on the training end also within populations of color and therapists? So
Great. So this is the Boston Psychedelic Research Group. And I wanted to talk just for a moment about the research piece. I don't know that the three of you were on in the earlier session we did, which were breakout groups, and then talking about what different people were involved with. And I mentioned that we're looking at doing a multi-site RCT around ketamine, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Because to this point, it's, like, okay, I believe you, it works. Show me like hard clinical data that will turn it into $1 billion payment stream coming from Medicare, Medicaid, EMA, et cetera. What are the opportunities within the research community to explore questions related to care delivery? And what are the biggest obstacles and possibilities there?
I think something that we hold at Synthesis, and I know Ronan touched on it, which I was glad to hear, is this idea of doing group work, not just for the idea of being able to reduce cost of care, but also from what we've seen and what we learned from wisdom traditions that have been doing work with psychedelics for thousands of years, is there's also a lot of deep healing that happens when people come together in a group and access expanded states. In our retreats, we see that people, and not just our retreats all over the world, we see people form really tight bonds and come together and form this really strong community around these experiences, particularly as we're still in a phase in society where these experiences are not well understood or embraced. And so, I would really love to see validation of a group model for a couple of reasons. And starting to see that narrative being that rather than we're focusing on individuals healing, that we can kind of heal as a collective and heal as groups as we bring this work to the world.
Great. So does the idea of doing real validating trials for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy make sense to the people in this group? RCTs, rigorous, leading institutions, sort of very expensive, and the result of it will be hopefully determinative that, yes, this is really helpful, or if it's not determinative of that. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Can you rephrase the question one more time? I apologize.
Sure. So I'm directly involved, but as are a number of others, in a putting together a multi-site randomized control trial for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, probably also looking at comorbidities. So, does this help? Because it's a lot easier to get third-party payers. They have to reimburse mental health. But if you're also helping somebody with diabetes become less symptomatic, that the economic case there just becomes very, very compelling. So looking at that, does that make any sense? You all are in the field every day, either with psilocybin or ketamine, and eventually with MDMA. Do we need that kind of work, or should that money better be spent elsewhere?
I personally think it absolutely needs to be done, because it'll also lead to us being able to negotiate contracts with hospitals in the long run and get the care out to more populations. So I think there's so many different angles within the psychedelic movement moving forward, and I think each one of them have a tremendous amount of value, and that this is a really important piece to drive forward if we can continue to get funding for it.
I would echo that. Sorry, I was just making sure I saw from mute, which is to say, I think all data is incredibly powerful right now, and I think it would be incredibly helpful in terms of coverage, payers, etc., to have a more concrete study, a more robust study on ketamine-assisted therapy, and the reason I hesitated when you asked the question, Dick, was really the opportunity cost associated with it, which is, could this money be better spent elsewhere? And I stopped and thought about that for a second, and my immediate reaction, with the benefit of about 20 seconds of contemplation, was I still think it's worthwhile, which is, I think this is some of the foundational work that's going to drive broad-based medical acceptance of this kind of therapy. And it seems that from an industry perspective, there's no shortage of capital and science focused into new innovative molecules, technologies, delivery mechanisms, all that kind of stuff. But with ketamine assisted therapy, because it's harder to recoup the investment from an investment perspective, it's a great opportunity for nonprofit work or other organizations to step in and start to establish what I think is very foundational work for the future of this whole sector of medicine.
Although if I could push back for a second, to the extent that ketamine assisted psychotherapy is fully reimbursed, it's incredibly valuable for your business model. Wouldn't it be?
Absolutely. And yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the point, I'm making. It's incredibly valuable for us. So, we are supportive of it. Could we generate an ROI on it? I don't know, simply because the benefits of that research would be a common good, right? And that's why you're not seeing that level of research, I think, being conducted from an industry perspective. It's hard to justify those ROIs. Even right now, we look at Compass Pathways from a business perspective, and they do have some IP, they have generated some patents, but I still have fundamental questions about whether they can generate an ROI on the $250 million or so it's going to cost them to get psilocybin through to approval in 2020, 2025, 2026. And they do have IP. Here, there's no evident IP that could be available. And so as much as I know wading into conversations about capitalism and ROI and patents is a sensitive subject within the psychedelic community, it still is a fundamental question of how do you make that spend worthwhile? And at least with ketamine, it's unclear to me how we could do that.
So you raised a question that there's a lot of conversation, and I certainly don't want to refer to any particular companies or anything like that, but there's a fundamental question of, Julie, you talked about the open praxis statement, and under the open praxis statement, essentially, all knowledge is for the common good. You're not allowed to make money from patents other than recovering administrative costs of things. And then on the other hand, you have this tremendous need for $250 million per study or per approval process to generate this. And an example, again, not to pick on a particular company, but it happened last week. Compass in a secondary offering raised more money than MAPS has in 38 years. And that's in like a secondary that is. So clearly there's a lot of capital needed and a lot of capital available and a lot of issues that come with having a lot of, with that model. And on the other side, how do you drive this at massive scale? Because it is a many billion-dollar issue, question, problem, opportunity, need. How do you drive that within the various for-profit models that each of you is involved with?
I'll just use MAPS as an example of how I really appreciate this level of thoughtfulness Rick has put into, creating MAPS Public Benefit Corporation and putting a limit on the patent for 5 years. So it maintains the open praxis mentality because really they are utilizing the patent just to help them complete the research and see it all the way through, but then not maintaining that patent so as to kind of edge people out of the marketplace in that sort of way. So that's, I guess, one example that I would give where I feel like it is possible to hold both ends of the spectrum there.
I found, being a lawyer by training, I've found a lot of the conversation around patents in this industry to be, generally reflective of a fairly narrow and probably, I'll say, incomplete understanding of patents. I mean, as Julie noted, 5 years with MAPS on the patent, and then it goes open praxis is thoughtful, but that's the nature of patent law in the first place. I mean, it's 20 years as opposed to 5 years, but the balance struck with the whole patent system is that people are given a monopoly for a temporary period of time after which it goes into the public domain. So whether it's 5 years or 20 years is the appropriate number is a fair discourse, and I don't have the right answer for it, but it is inherently baked into the system. Now, certainly, particularly in the United States, the patent system has been used and abused to restrict competition as opposed to enhance it, and that's unfortunate. But I think that's a conversation more about the appropriate use of patents as opposed to whether patenting it within the context of the psychedelic industry is right or wrong. And, you know, as Julie noted, I think Rick, I'm sure many people saw the conversation that took place between Tim Ferriss and Christian Angermeyer and Rick Doblin and a couple other online a few weeks ago. I thought Rick's perspective was spot on, which is if you've done something innovative and inventive and you spent the money to validate that, then you should have something to protect. And if you're trying to patent something that's clearly in the public domain, then you should get your hand slapped. And that, I think, is a very appropriate assessment of what should be happening. And by and large, I think that's been happening, although I do stand to be educated on that because I don't have a full perspective on exactly what Compass has attempted to patent, using that as a specific example, and what they've been granted. I don't have the full color on that, but I do think the system as it exists right now should be relatively well equipped to address a lot of concerns around this.
Add a little bit of color, like I think really we always try to acknowledge all the different approaches and all the different value to the different approaches. I do think there's, with some of the controversy around IP and patents, there's some things we can specifically point to and kind of maybe be concerned, but overwhelmingly this idea that like, this is, I'd say like, this is the only way, or this is the way that it has to happen because this is how the system works is not necessarily one that we fully agree with. And it's one reason we're so interested in what's going on in Oregon. Oregon has basically said, we're going to have a really community-driven approach. We want the community came out and voted to pass this new regulation that says we don't want this to be healthcare only treatment. We want this to be safe and regulated, but we want it to happen in group settings. We want it to happen if people aren't only diagnosed as unwell. And so I think it's just like taking some of the learnings from outside of our modern everyday world and seeing how things have been used traditionally, and also being super intentional about how we bring this to society is, I think there's a concern that over medicalizing psychedelics could, and kind of rushing them into the current system could lead to some undesirable outcomes of, as Julie mentioned, maybe leveraging the research process to extract profit rather than create the most good. So it's definitely like a very delicate, nuanced topic, and I'm very hopeful, I think, to see so many different approaches, including decriminalization, coming online, because I think that's ultimately going to be how we reach the most people. We already know with the healthcare system in the States, at least, it's got tons of flaws of not reaching the people most in need. So, and the clinical research process has led to a lot of these challenges that do exist in the current healthcare system. So I don't think we can put all our eggs in one basket saying this is the way that it needs to go, and really work with ethics and integrity to shape all the ways simultaneously.
So can you share, because you've been very involved in Oregon, are there any things there that are designed to help expand access to needy populations most in need? Are there third-party payer systems? Are there something at scale? You know, again, not like this is great, we'll get 10 people in, which is what about the other?
I can share a little bit. So the formal Oregon Health Authority Advisory Board has only met as a full group twice. They just started at the end of March, and they have some subcommittees going on. So there really hasn't been a lot of decisions made yet, just some acknowledgements of how the process is going to go. One of the first subcommittees made was a ethics and access subcommittee, and the governor of Oregon even in their press release for this advisory board even acknowledged how much of a focus they want that to be for the state. So I still hold it as one of the bigger questions just from doing our work in the Netherlands, really knowing that when you start to talk about affordability, just very very closely start to strip away levels of care and touch points that could be seen as very important. So I know I've talked to some people, including Leah Mix, who Julie mentioned, is working on different ways that maybe corporations could pay for psilocybin services in Oregon as an employee benefit or a deductible expense. And say, haven't seen anything so far that is an overwhelming solution to this big question. But I know that the intention of the Oregon measure, even though it kind of circumvents the FDA process, is to be very open and work with the federal regulators and produce a lot of data that helps validate this alternative approach to a purely medical approach.
Great, great. So the other another question is, and Julie, you sort of led to this, but you were talking about the shortage in therapists. And one comment you made is the importance that you were stating of therapists actually having an experience, a personal experience, so that they understand what their patients or what their clients or patients will be going through. Can ketamine fill that? Can it be holotropic breath work? Does it have to be same substance? Any thoughts from any of you on that? A, if it's important, Julia asserted that it is important. And secondly, if you think it's important, are other modalities for creating an expanded consciousness acceptable?
I can share that we definitely stand in the camp of saying that it is important. I'd say it's funny, we keep pulling on things that Rick said, and I remember something that I heard Rick say in an interview that it's probably not required, but he would, I'm probably paraphrasing, but you can imagine that someone with that self-experience could be a much more compassionate, understanding, potentially a better facilitator of the experience. The way we see our work is we believe that is really important, and a depth of understanding in multiple expanded states. One reason why this training program we just developed does include people coming and having 2 or 3 self-experiences in the Netherlands with psilocybin, as well as being able to be in a retreat space with more experienced facilitators to kind of learn the ins and outs of how to navigate these expanded states. So I think that's the approach that we have today is the more the better. It's really difficult to say that this number of self-experiences would be the right amount, especially because everyone reacts so differently and goes on their own journey with it. But we're definitely supportive of that narrative being continued to be pushed.
Great.
Oh, I just wanted to say really quickly, I think I already spoke to the experience piece, but that you asked about different states in terms of different medicines and specifically, and you know, I think that's really due to the bottleneck. I think that's a hard one. I think that ideally, in the same way that as I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I have somatic experiencing training, but I haven't done the same level of clinical hours as a psychologist. I wouldn't necessarily do weekly individual psychotherapy for a client, or I would take on a somatic experiencing client, but I wouldn't necessarily take on a client who's wanting to work or be more beneficial to do psychoanalysis or kind of more Jungian work, for instance. And so, but I can hold a therapeutic container. So while it is possible, it depends on the depth of the container that the individual can hold, whether or not they have experience with that specific medicine and its terrain.
Great. Thank you.
My perspective, just briefly, actually, I'd go back to a point Julie made, and I feel like I'm referencing you often, Julie, so thank you for all the thoughtful commentary you've provided, but I don't think it's essential. You know, I think psychedelics are one path towards healing and growth, but they're not the only path. And so to the point Julie made, which is you can only take someone as far as you've gone. People have gone a lot farther without psychedelics in some cases than with psychedelics, or they've gone a lot farther never having used psychedelics than many psychedelic practitioners have gone with themselves. So I think it really is situational specific, but in general, I do think it's a good idea that the therapists and the guides do have experience because it will help them go farther.
Great. Thank you. So before concluding this section, because Rick will be joining us very shortly here, if there was one thought that you wanted to make sure people left this call with, what might that thought be? Sorry, I said a
That's a
pretty
good question.
All right, it can be a thought and a half. Tell you what, I'll give you all a moment to think about that. Where I wanted to do a couple things. One, thank people who've submitted questions. We've gotten to a lot of them, but we can't get to all of them in the time. So thank you all for your interest and your participation. And secondly, I wanted to invite everyone on this call and all the members of BPRG to another upcoming non-BPRG event, but BPRG is fully invited on June 2nd with J.R. Ron, who's the CEO and founder of MindMed, which is another leading company in this space that just last week listed on a US stock exchange. But in any case, so if people are interested, I think easiest might be to just send a note to info@bprg.org, and we'll make sure to connect you and get you an invitation. All right, I gave you all breathing room. Your great thoughts.
I'll happily go first. A lot of pressure, but yeah, I think just a reflection about intentionality, about how we bring psychedelics and this medicine to the modern world, and even though there is this overwhelming need, not necessarily thinking that size or speed or scale is inherently the best way. There's a lot we still need to learn about how to incorporate psychedelics into society, and I think we really have an opportunity here to do it in a way that doesn't replicate the problems that we already see in our healthcare system or in our capitalist society, and leverage the benefits of those things, but not rush to do it in a way that just kind of one for another.
Hour? Okay.
Can someone please mute whoever's in the background? Sorry, now I guess the speakers were accidentally muted. So for the speakers, please, we have to unmute ourselves. So yes, that's great. Next. You're muted. You're
Go ahead,
muted. Ronnie. You're still muted. Ronan, I'll tell you what, Julie, can you address it? And meanwhile, Sherry, can you try to help Ronan unmute himself, please?
Yeah, I think just the biggest point that I would leave this with is how, how collaborative, again, I think I mentioned this before, there's so many different angles to be approaching the psychedelic space from, and that's why I'm actually really appreciative of this panel today. I think Miles, Ronan, and I each represent different but complementary aspects of the psychedelic space. And so the thing that I would really leave is how important it is for us to be kind of creating that bigger umbrella by, supporting each other in our different initiatives from the different angles. And the more that we're able to do that, the more that the general public, as well as the regulatory agencies, are going to see the importance of this work, and the better we're going to be able to move things forward. So I think that's my 2 cents that I have right now. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for kind of sharing the thought that I was going to offer, which is I think this emergent space involves a lot of complementary efforts from for-profit organizations rooted in a more conventional approach to the delivery of care to novel business models or operations within a wellness paradigm like Synthesis is doing, as well as to taking on the broader considerations around drug policy reform, which I think is important, and just changing the conversation. This isn't just about psychedelic medicine. I do really believe that, and it should be done incrementally, but I really believe that this is the initiation of a conversation about how we approach health and wellness altogether, how we view humans and people and life and biology. And I think it's all important, but I think it needs to be done incrementally. And I think we need to focus on doing it thoughtfully and collaboratively and leveraging each other's strengths and trying to balance out for the limitations in each other's models. And there's going to be upsides and downsides to all equations. But I think collectively, my sense is everybody so far, by and large, is doing it for the right reasons. So everyone, let's keep an open mind and an open conversation. And I think we can achieve a lot of wonderful things.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for joining, for sharing your insights and for the great work that you're all doing in the world. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Anne, who will be, I don't know that Rick needs introduction, but we'll be transitioning to Rick. So thank you all so much for joining, and please stay for the balance.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks to all of you for being with us. It was a really great discussion. Thanks, Dick, for moderating. It's the first time we've had a discussion, and I think we definitely will have some more because it's been very, very rich. Thank you. And as Dick said, the next person doesn't really need an introduction. So Rick, we're so happy you're with us.
Oh,
take
great.
it away. Thank you, Rick.
Okay. Well, a bunch of stuff has happened since the last report, and I really enjoyed the parts of the discussion I just heard as well about collaboration and different approaches to trying to achieve similar goals. So the first thing that I want to report is that we are still waiting on the Nature Medicine paper, which will report on our phase 3 results from our first phase 3 study. We've submitted the final proofs that will be in the next couple weeks. You know, we had outstanding results from our first phase 3 study. We have a New York Times article that's all ready to go. It's been edited, that will be released when the Nature Medicine article comes out. And I think that'll be a big turning point for us because we got such incredibly statistically significant results with large effect sizes that once people see that, they're going to come to the conclusion most likely that our second phase 3 study will work out as well. You know, it's underway. It's a challenge recruiting people. The pandemic isn't over. Recruitment is going slower than we thought. And so that's our major challenge now, is to increase enrollment in our second phase 3 study. But as part of this sort of public education campaign that we're wanting to launch, the publication of the Nature Medicine article, I've asked Tom Insel and Paul Summergrad, Tom being the former president or the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Paul being the former president of the American Psychiatric Association. I've asked them to write an op-ed for the Washington Post, we hope. Washington Post editors have said they'll take a look at it. So we've just submitted that. And I just want to say, in terms of the previous discussion, talking about the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, that I asked both Paul and Tom to write about two different things. One is the article in Nature Medicine. The other was the New England Journal of Medicine article that was by Robin Card Harris that compared psilocybin with SSRIs for depression. And what it turned out that both Tom and Paul wanted to write about was those two things and how this is very promising for the future of psychiatry. But they also spoke about the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative that I didn't anticipate. And they both expressed some cautions about it. And in particular, their caution was about unlicensed or guides, people that are trained by the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative to do work with mental illness for which they may not have the licenses. So I think that's a concern we've heard a lot about from sort of, you could say, mainstream psychiatry and psychotherapy is how are we going to, how that's going to be managed. And so from what I understand, there's now more of a thought going into potentially like a two-tiered system where those people that have the licenses can be talking about working with people with mental illnesses, and those people that don't can talk about personal growth and spirituality and things like that. I think it's crucially important that there be opportunities for people that don't have a diagnosis to have these experiences in a legal context. So very supportive of the organ psilocybin initiative, but I just wanted to note that that's a big concern that's going to be coming up. So as far as this move towards the Nature Medicine article and this understanding that chances are we're moving towards prescription approval, I have something else to announce, which I think is going to have a big impact on the field in multiple different ways, both now and post-approval. And that's that we have filed a formal dispute resolution request with FDA about 3 different issues. The first one was that about 2 years ago, we submitted a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. We called it MT2. We have MT1, MDMA therapist, MT1. MT1 was approved over 10 years ago, and it was approved by FDA. We have 120 people that the study can be for. We've already enrolled about 90, and it's a 4-day-long study. We're preparing people at that point for phase 3 for controlled studies. So one-day therapists, therapists who want to can volunteer for this protocol. We do think it should be voluntary, not mandatory, but one day they get either MDMA or placebo for an 8-hour session. The next day is a day of integration. Then there's the crossover, and it's double blind, so they don't know what they're getting. The third day they get what they didn't get the first day, and then there's another day of integration. So we felt for training people for post-approval or training people for expanded access where there are no control groups, it would be better to make it into just a 2-day instead of a 4-day experience. So we eliminate the placebo and the day of integration. After the placebo, everybody knows they're going to get MDMA, and they get an experience with MDMA, and then the next day is a day of integration. So about 2 years ago, we submitted that to the FDA, and they put it on clinical hold. They said that this was too risky, that this was unjustified, that there was no demonstrated benefits. So then what we did was, well, okay, that's one of their complaints. The other thing they said was that now, despite what they've agreed to in phase 3, now they want to make it so that the lead therapist of the co-therapist team needs to be an MD or a PhD, not just licensed as a therapist. And on top of that, they said that now there should be a doctor on site rather than on call. So in phase 3, where we negotiated through special protocol assessment process that took us 8 months in 2017, we've agreed that phase 3, the lead therapist just needs to be licensed as a therapist. The second person doesn't need to have a license. They can be in a program to get a license, but they don't need a license. Or they have 1,000 hours behavioral health experience, and that they need a bachelor's degree, which we also think is unnecessary. But that's what we agreed on in phase 3. And then the doctor does the prescriptions. The doctor gets the Schedule 1 license. The doctor does the screening, but the doctor doesn't need to be on site, just on call. So that's what we agreed with in phase 3. So this new protocol, MT2, FDA said, forget it, we're not even going to let you do it. You should kind of abandon this idea. The risks are too great. And there was one of our therapists that had some suicidal ideation during the experience, which resolved successfully by the end of the experience with long-term benefits. But the FDA said, this is a terrible thing, this suicidal ideation, we got to shut this thing down. MD, PhD, and then doctor on site. So what we did then is submit a variety of different responses to FDA, which were ignored in substance. What we did is we worked with Janice Phelps at CIS, and we gathered about 22 letters from experts in the field of psychotherapy, of psychiatry, of training of therapists, all to say that the MD, PhD idea didn't really matter, that it wasn't a good idea, that the FDA doesn't understand psychotherapy, that if you're an MD, now this wasn't limited to psychiatrists, you're not necessarily a better therapist than someone who is licensed to do therapy. If you're a psychiatrist, you're not necessarily a better therapist than somebody that's licensed to do therapy. You don't get much training necessarily to become a psychiatrist in psychotherapy. And we also said that having a doctor on as part of the team doesn't really increase safety when you do the proper screenings. So that was one part of it. Then, and we got all these letters. Then we did a survey of the various people that were that volunteered to take MDMA, and we asked them how valuable it was to them personally or professionally, and what risks they had. And it was overwhelmingly positive, extremely positive. We submitted that to the FDA. And then we looked at all of our phase 3 data, and we compared those sites that had an MD or PhD on them compared to those sites that didn't have an MD PhD, and we looked at the efficacy, no differences. Then we looked at those sites that had a doctor on site or compared to on call for safety, no differences in safety. So we presented all this information to FDA, and they just said no. They didn't deal with us substantively. So what we felt was going on is that the Division of Psychiatry, now seeing that this is going to be emerging as a potential medicine, are very nervous about anything going wrong and them being criticized for it. And so what they wanted to do is look like they were being tough, or in their own minds that they would be rigorous about bureaucrats evaluating the risks, because the legacy of this is that roughly 25 years ago, this same group, not Division of Psychiatry, but their predecessor in FDA history, approved OxyContin. And so for long-term use without proper data, and everything has been subpoenaed, and all the data, all the FDA documents are now being reviewed, and they all know that. So what it seemed to us is that they're trying to create a track record. If anything goes wrong in the future, they get, they'll be harsh, you know, MD, PhDs, doctor on site, even though there was no evidence for it. But we didn't necessarily think that they really wanted those things or would insist on those things. And then we felt that when they didn't respond substantively to our arguments, they were inviting us to appeal. And the FDA has this process called formal dispute resolution requests. Several people advised us not to do it, that we're going to upset the division, we're going to appeal, and we're going to cause higher levels of FDA to review their decisions. But we felt that these decisions were like a poison pill for future approval, post-approval. If they could get those things in place now, they might be able to say post-approval, MD, PhD is required, doctor on site. And what that would do is it would knock out all small psychotherapy practices where people can't afford to have a doctor on site, and there's no need to do that. And then to pass those costs on to the therapist. The MD, PhD would limit the number of people that could provide this training. It would just be relatively poison pill, as I said. So we decided that we would appeal. And what we ended up doing is hiring some incredible lawyers at a firm called Hyman and Phelps to assist us. They specialize in these formal dispute resolution request appeals with FDA. We've spent over $250,000 on lawyers for this, which in the end, I must say, was worth it, surprisingly. So 2 weeks ago, Friday, we got the response back from FDA. And what they said was that the senior leadership of the Office of Neuroscience, under which the Division of Psychiatry is a part, that they have realized that these policies that the division was trying to put into place did not follow FDA rules and regulations. You don't have to show benefits for phase 1 study. Phase 1 study is healthy volunteers, mostly looking at safety or scientific studies. That, you know, there can be scientific information that benefits humanity. It's not that you have to have benefits for each individual person in a phase 1 study. So what the senior leadership did is they removed the clinical hold that has been on this study for now almost a year and a half. And so we can now go forward with this protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. The senior leadership also looked at this whole argument about MD, PhD, and they said that there was no merit in that argument, that is not going to be a requirement going forward. So we've knocked out the MD, PhD as well. And then the final thing that they said was that there is no evidence based upon the data that we have so far from our studies that we need a doctor on site. That they looked at the phase 3 data, they looked at our phase 2 data where we also didn't have to have a doctor on site, and the FDA senior leadership said that that's not a requirement anymore. So we took this as a tremendous, tremendous victory, and it's not just a victory for us, it's for the whole field. Because as we go forward and we really want to implement these things, one of the biggest challenges is going to be cost, and how do we deal with that? And so if we can actually now have licensed therapists. We will have further discussions with FDA about the credentialing of the second person. We don't really think that they need to be a bachelor's degree, that we want them to potentially be a student. We want to keep the two-person model, basically. I think it's safer and better. It's not twice as safe or twice as good, but the key challenge is going to be affording it. Can we afford it? And that means, what do we do about the credentialing, and particularly the credentialing of the second person? So this was delightful. Now, the other thing was that 2 days before we heard from the FDA, there was an online seminar that the FDA was offering about various topics. Several people from the Division of Psychiatry were there, and several people from MAPS were there, from the Public Benefit Corp. And they interacted very, very friendly. It was terrific. They were all supportive. And this was at a time when the FDA Division of Psychiatry knew that they were going to be overruled, but we didn't know it yet. It was just 2 days before. So this friendly interchange tells us that the division did not really mind being overruled, that they're not holding it against us personally, that this was, like, as I said, bureaucratic self-protectionism that they were trying to put into place. But they really want us to go forward. They want us to succeed. They're going to be willing to work with us. So it was just delightful what happened there. So now I want to say a little bit, we have started in Europe. We've treated the first person in Europe. That first person turned out to be a police officer with trauma. So it's part of this whole effort to try to, move beyond the stereotypes of who is this treatment for. Also, last week we heard from Elizabeth Koch, who's a major philanthropist who cares a lot about trauma. And so she's donated $1 million a year for 3 years for Europe, for us to bring MDMA therapy to Europe. So, that's moving forward. We're going to need a bunch more, of course, a whole lot more, because they want us to do a whole other phase 3 study, the EMA. But we're now moving to Europe. The next sites to open up, we think, are going to be in the Czech Republic, then potentially Germany, Portugal, England, and Norway. So things are moving forward in Europe. So the other big news is that we have paid $750,000 to the Boston Consulting Group to help us work on the plan for commercialization. So, my dissertation was on the regulation of medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. We've brought in a bunch of people over from Big Pharma. We've joked before about, we call them our refugees from Big Pharma. And so we're experts in drug development. But where we lack the expertise so far has been in commercializing once you end up having an approved product. What does it take to really commercialize it? And so the Boston Consulting Group is great allies in this. They said that it would normally charge a corporation $2 million for what they charged us $750,000 for. The main person in charge of this was David Bronner's roommate at college, and was the first person to give David LSD. So their friendship goes way back. And so we've gotten the reports. We're continuing to work with them. But what I want to talk about is some of the issues that we're going to be needing to address. So what they're recommending is an enormous amount of investment in the neighborhood of $70 or $80 million for planning for commercialization. They're saying, if we were Big Pharma, this is what we would do. So now, we work at a much lower cost than Big Pharma. We have all sorts of volunteers, all of this. But what they're saying, the other two things that they have shared with us that I found particularly interesting, and one that really changed my view on things, was the first thing they talk about is, I thought that when we develop MDMA for PTSD, the next most logical thing for us to do is other indications of MDMA. Now, in the US, we're going to have what will in effect be 6 years of data exclusivity. So we've talked about that before, but I'll just say data exclusivity is different than a patent in that it's incentives for developing drugs that are off patent. And so what it means is no one can use your data to market a generic for a period of time. In the US, it's 5 years. You get 6 months for pediatric studies. It blocks a generic competitor from applying until 5.5 years is over. It takes FDA around 6 months or more to review the generic competitor's application. So it'll be 6 years. In Europe, it's 10 years data exclusivity. So it seemed to me that then when you do a new indication for the same drug, you no longer get the 5 years, you get the 3 years, and then you do a pediatric study in that, you get 3.5 years. So the thing that BCG told us, and we believe this is probably right, is that once the data exclusivity expires, there's going to be such a large market. Now, we're assuming that between now and the end of data exclusivity, we're assuming 2 years from now we get approval. Sometime in 2029, the data exclusivity expires. We anticipate having in the neighborhood of around 28,000 therapists trained by that point. So we're ramping up our therapist training program. We've got all that. But what they're saying is that, or what this BCG report is saying, is that once the data exclusivity expires, even if we get these extensions for new indications, the payers will buy from the generic suppliers. So this is, I think, a really crucial point, is that if the payers buy from the generic suppliers, then it's hard to make an economic case that we should be developing all of these other indications, because you may or may not need 2 phase 3 studies. They'll be smaller than the current ones because we've already demonstrated safety. So what it suggests is that if we're going to do other indications of MDMA, we should do them sooner rather than later. The BCG report is also suggesting that we'll have excess capacity, that we'll be able to train enough therapists that the amount of patients, they'll be able to handle them and more. So the other part that BCG shared with us is that what they call the generic cliff, which is what happens when a drug goes generic, and they're suggesting that it could drop in price by 95%, something like that. Now, that's going to be a challenge again. So that what BCG is now suggesting is that we've got this period of time where, limited period of time, where we can sell MDMA to profit through the Public Benefit Corporation, which is, again, 100% owned by the nonprofit. And whatever profits we make will be used for the mission of MAPS. So now there's some internal discussions that I think are disturbing, so that we're trying to figure out to globalize, to go to Europe and to globalize, to go where the trauma is, not where the money is, or not only where the money is, that we will need somewhere in the neighborhood, and this is going to be an astounding amount of money, we will need somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 million, $50 million a year for 3 years. We have discussions already with investors that are willing to put in the money. We don't want to take investor money. That's the last resort, but we're trying to evaluate that as a possibility. The medium possibility is loans on the basis of paying from royalties from selling MDMA by prescription. So we think that that's something that's possible. On the other hand, we don't have FDA approval. So there's a certain kind of risk that the initial people, so we're talking about 50 million a year for 3 years with milestones at each point. And that permits us to complete the research, to commercialize, and to globalize. Now, whether the first choice is philanthropy. So we're going to see what we can do with philanthropy. Some of the issues that are addressed now, and this is a shocking thing to me, is just that we've been suggested, not by BCG, but a few internal, this is a minority view, and I don't think it's going to prevail, but people are saying, well, if we have to borrow this money, or if we can get it from philanthropy, if we have to borrow this money, how do we make sure we can pay it back? You know, that's going to be really important. The people that are going to give it to us have to take a certain risk. They might not get it back. So some people have said, well, we've got this IP, in this intellectual property on the production of MDMA. That's what Compass is patented, their intellectual property. Now, we're not going to, do overbroad patents. We're probably not even going to do this, but the suggestion was that we should patent the IP to make it potentially slower for generic competitors to figure out, how to compete with us. First off, I don't think that's going to work. Generic competitors can easily figure out another way around it. There's other reasons, but it's just these pressures now that if we aren't funded by philanthropy, how does that impact our choices? So I think we're going to end up making this information public. I don't think it's really going to help generic competitors anyway, but that's it. The other big issue that is where your values come into play is pricing. Where do we price the drug? Now we're anticipating, and this is really early on, and there's so much that goes on to creating a medical drug, but we're anticipating that our cost is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 a dose. I mean, that's outrageous, right? Because you can buy MDMA for $5 or $10 a dose, but still, medical grade, package, all this kind of stuff, $25 a dose. So that's our cost. And but the price of the drug is completely separate from the cost of the drug. So now, then the big question is, who pays the price? So insurance, so a lot of people are insured, 1/3 or so are not insured, but for those people that are insured, most of the money will be paid for by the insurance companies. And you can have all these patient assistance programs and things like that. So we're learning a lot about that. So I'd say that the big question of where does public benefit and profit come into play when you have a public benefit corp that maximizes public benefits, it's going to be on the issue of pricing. And there is a price at which BCG was pointing out where you make more money, but you price some people out of the market. So it looks like the maximum income point over these years of data exclusivity in the US would leave about 250,000 less people treated. All right, so that's a big thing. But then the question is, and this is to be a fully complex environment, and I will end in 1 or 2 minutes in, so don't worry, so what do we do with the money? So let's assume that we leave 250,000 people out of getting treated in the US. This is just US. This is not focused on Australia. But what if we make a bunch of money and then we decide to bring it to people in Africa, people elsewhere that can't afford it? So it's not just, where does the price set so that we don't treat the maximum number of people in the US, but what do we do with the resources? And then how many people can be treated in that way? So it's going to be really interesting, this whole discussion of pricing. We're having a board retreat in June to try to sort this out. My thought is that once the Nature Medicine article comes out, and also the New York Times article and other things, that'll be the best moment for philanthropy. We'll try that for a couple of months. We'll see how that goes. Then we will, or we may simultaneously go for philanthropy and also offer the opportunity for people to sign up if they want to give us loans if we don't make the philanthropy. Now, also just as an idea that the risk gets less and less as time goes by. So we're currently anticipating the interim analysis for our second phase 3 study to be in May of 2022. So basically a year from now, we hope we'll have the interim analysis for the second phase 3 study. If that's positive, then that suggests we're on a glide path to approval. So whatever funds we might want to raise after that should be at a lower interest rate if we have to do loans than now, because now there's more of a risk about the phase 3 study. So those are just the challenges as we move from focusing on trying to do the research to now thinking ahead. If the research really succeeds, then how do we move forward? So we'll look forward to having a lot more of these discussions, and a lot of it will involve ethics and priorities, and it's going to be challenging, but we very much are eager to do it in a more public way.
Wow. Wow. My least favorite job is telling Rick his time is up. I wish we could just hang out all afternoon, but amazing, Rick. Every 2 months is more and more amazing. Congratulations with the FDA. That's huge news. It's really wonderful. And thanks for getting us all thinking about the next steps that you're working with, because they're huge and so important for all of us to think about. So I wish I could just hand you 50 million right now, but I can't quite do that.
Well, we'll take 45 million. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let me check with shipping. Okay, so we can certainly keep this room open, but I want to just be aware of the time. Thanks to everyone who's come. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dick. Thank you for the panelists. It's been an amazing afternoon. We'll see you all back in July.
Oh, I see a question from Angie. If there'd be time for me to answer that.
I think people would love, anyone who needs to go can go, and anyone who wants to stay can stay. So,
okay. Okay, great. So Angie asked, do you anticipate MDMA being rescheduled? And if so, does that bypass the data exclusivity protection so that others can use MDMA outside of the MAPS protocol? Well, yes, we have to have MDMA rescheduled because otherwise it stays in Schedule 1 and it can't be used as a medicine. Many people may not know that not only does FDA and DEA have to recommend a rescheduling, but the states have to reschedule as well. And there were some states that never wanted methadone. So that even if the FDA and DEA do it, you may not get every single state to reschedule, in which case MDMA cannot be used in that state. But we think more likely because of the veterans, because of the sort of bipartisan support, that we will be able to get MDMA rescheduled in every state. Now we're working with Pinney Associates. They're an expert in abuse liability of drugs. And they're the ones that worked with Roland Griffiths and Matt Johnson. They published a paper on the 8-factor analysis of, it's the legal standard, this 8-factor analysis to look at drug abuse liability of drugs to figure out what schedules they go in. And they recommended that psilocybin be in Schedule 4, which is really remarkable. We're working with the same group. We've done our own analysis of this data, the abuse liability. The chances are we're going to go for Schedule 3 rather than Schedule 4. The big thing is to get out of Schedule 2. There's a lot more paperwork, and you need a new prescription every time. You know, for Schedule 3, you could say I prescribed, you know, a course of 3 sessions. For Schedule 2, you wouldn't be able to do that. A lot more tracking by the DEA. So it will be rescheduled. The other part of the question, though, was really about this. How can people use MDMA outside the MAPS protocol? So first off, we train therapists. Part of the REMS, the risk evaluation mitigation strategies that we're negotiating with FDA and DEA, are going to be that the only people that can provide therapy are people that have been trained in our method. And we're going to try to import the training into schools of psychiatry, psychotherapy, not just CIS, which is certificate, but we're talking with Janice about doing an MT2 protocol as part of CIS, about making it their academic credit that people get. And so what we're going to be trying to do is to, you know, train people, but then they can innovate so that people can use MDMA outside of our protocol in a medicalized insurance context, even if they don't do our method. So we'll sort of have a 2-layer system. One is, this is our method. The other will say you're MAPS certified. You know, so people will know that if they go to you, they're getting what the MAPS method, but you can innovate if you want to. The other main way to make it accessible to people outside of a MAPS protocol is drug policy reform. And so I think that's why I was glad to hear Ronan talk about the support for drug policy reform. And I think it's just really important to have these parallel tracks, drug policy reform and not. So that's the answer to that question. Dick, I see you asked about why is there so much focus on the cost of the medicine and that the cost is a few percent of the cost of the overall treatment. Well, first off, the cost of the medicine might not be a small percent of the overall treatment. It could be a substantial percentage of the overall treatment, depending on where we set the price. But the point is, and I think that you're making, which is a good one, is that even if we had patient assistance programs for people that don't have insurance, and we can cover the cost of the drug, people can't afford the therapy. So what do we do about that? So that's where I talked about, what if we charge the maximum amount of money, 250,000 people don't get treated? I mean, these are, again, total millions of assumptions based on these numbers. So nobody should believe these numbers are right, but just as a general frame of thought, maybe with this other money, we also subsidize therapy as well. So that would be extremely unusual for a pharma company to subsidize the non-drug portions of the treatment. But that's a possibility. But I think that when we really think about accessibility, there's only so much that we can do on the price of the drug, that there will be all these people that are, now the main things that we can do, and I didn't mention this before, is group therapy. So we're trying to understand group therapy. Can that bring down the cost of it? We have a protocol that's about to be submitted to the FDA for groups of 6 with 4 therapists and 6 patients. This will be at the Portland VA. Now, that's not necessarily the ideal size of a group. We're just exploring. There'll be 3 cohorts of 6 to test it out. So I think group therapy will be a big way to think about reducing the cost, and drug policy reform. And then the other is political. I mean, we all need to do a lot more on this parity for mental health treatment as compared to physical treatment. That's going to be a really big factor as well, to really help people understand that mental health needs to be treated and funded by insurance companies in the same way as physical health.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So I see another one from Ryan. Right now, the MDMA therapist training schedule offers breathwork as the experiential. Will these therapists be offered the opportunity to access MDMA? There's an interesting point here. So this is giving MDMA to therapists is our most expensive part of the training because it involves 2 therapists sitting with 1 person. That's why we tried to make it 2 days instead of 1 day. Now, the other complication is that you're not supposed to charge for a protocol. Protocols are supposed to be free to the subjects, other than expanded access, which is compassionate use, where people can charge. We're still trying to figure out what the cost will be to MAPS of this MT2. Maybe we can load the cost into the training program. So for sure, everybody who's a therapist that wants to do this can volunteer for the study if they pay for it themselves. But it could be really quite expensive. So what we're doing now is exploring options in Canada. So the Canadians have given therapists the permission to grow mushrooms and do psilocybin as part of their own training legally. And so we're trying now to get an exception similarly in Canada so therapists can access MDMA kind of like compassionate use, but without a protocol, without data gathering, with all the stuff that makes it more expensive. Because MT2 is still a protocol. We still have all sorts of measures. It's a study of self-compassion. Also in Israel, the Ministry of Health has now said that as part of their compassionate use program, they're going to allow the therapists working on compassionate use to get an MDMA experience without data gathering, just as part of their training. So we will potentially, once the borders open up between us and Canada, and if this gets approved in Canada, it's 2 months away or so, send hundreds or thousands of therapists up to Canada to get an MDMA experience. That's one possibility. Or we figure out some way to reduce our costs. And one way is to have the second person be another trainee and have just one of the therapists be the experienced therapist, introducing it to a new trainee with the other trainee with them and that working for free. So we've got various ways to think about that. In addition to contribution of dollars, how can we be helpful supporting MAPS? Well, again, let me just say politically, what we're working on now with Dan Crenshaw, who's a Navy SEAL from Texas, a Republican member of Congress, and Tim Ryan, who's a Democratic member of Congress from Ohio. So it's a bipartisan support for 2 bills in Congress. One is to give $25 million to the Department of Defense to do psychedelic research for PTSD. The other is to give $25 million to the VA to do psychedelic research for PTSD. In a meeting that we had with the central office of the VA, they said, "Don't do this. This is bad. We don't want you to tell us what to do." It was a shocker to me. It was like we stepped on a landmine. We're saying, we're giving you money. They're like, "Oh, you're going to just get it taken out of our other money." I was like, "No, it's going to be extra money." And then, look, I don't mind telling you what to do because I've been trying to get you to do MDMA research for 31 years and you're only now starting to do it and we have to pay for it. You're so far behind the curve if we have to pressure you and give you political cover. So what people could do is once they could contact members of Congress and say, support these bills, the Crenshaw-Ryan bill. We're getting ready to introduce it. The other thing is that we have been focusing on the large donor strategy, but what we've neglected is building up our membership base. So the whole situation has changed with psychedelics. And so we're looking for more monthly members just to build our base so that we, in a sense, can have large scale support for MAPS, and then the MAP staff can focus on raising all this other money. So it's a highly leveraged thing. So I think that now, Susan asks, will any licensed provider be able to provide this therapy after the data exclusivity period is over? Yeah, for sure. All the data exclusivity period means is that there aren't generics, but the REMS is going to stay the same. Oh, no, I think I misunderstood your question. So after data exclusivity expires, the generics still have to follow the REMS, the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. So licensed therapists will still need to go through our training, either with us or an academic institution, before being able to administer. And we'll have a separate training for prescribers. So let's say somebody is a doctor, they want to run a clinic. It'll just be like a 4 to 6 hour training on the risks of MDMA physically, a little bit about the therapy. Then they can be a prescriber, but they can't treat patients. So the REMS will happen. Will continue beyond the data exclusivity period. And we will continue MAPS trainings after the data exclusivity period over. And the Nature article is Nature Medicine, let's say. It's not Nature, but Nature Medicine is, we don't have a date yet. But we've just last week, we finished the proofs, the final proofs. And so we hope in around 2 weeks.
All right. Well, thank you for that extra time, Rick. Thank you for everyone's interest. I can't believe how many people have stayed on for all this time. That shows how much we love being with you, Rick.
Thank you.
But I also want to honor everyone's time. It's a Sunday afternoon, so I hope people can get out and breathe some fresh air. So we have another meeting in June, but we don't have an exact topic or presenter for the DOI. And then in July, we have Brian Morescu about the immortality key, but he's going to talk about other things too. We're not quite sure what, because he's got a lot going on that he wants to give us an update closer to the time. So thank you all, and hope we'll see you at our next meeting. Stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Hi, Sherry.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm sorry I forgot to give you a shout out. As always, you made it beautifully easy.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rick. Wonderful presentation.
Yeah, it's really exciting news. Ay, ay, ay.
40 million, Rick, not 45.
All right.
All right.
We'll make do.
Make do.
Yeah, it's outrageous what they're saying, what we need.
Yeah, yeah. And I saw something about Compass doing something incredible in the public sphere.
Oh, Dick, they raised in last week more than you've raised in 35 years.
Wow, I didn't hear that. What'd they do?
The second offering, apparently, that's what Dick said in his piece, that they raised last week with their second offering more than you've raised in 35 years.
How much did they raise?
I don't know.
I don't know. They're trading at 36. I don't know, Rick, but it's, I just waiting for Kerry and those others to challenge the patents. And I'm not going to the bank on Compass, I can tell you that.
Well, I think they have got a good chance of losing the patent on the polymorph form. You know, the patents are being challenged for sure. You know, I had an expert actually that was an expert in patents and in these polymorph forms. And this fellow said that he wanted to help out to challenge the patent application. And so I put him in touch with Kerry, and Kerry said, we don't need you. We've got our other experts, and, you know, I've got it covered already.
Interesting.
So, you know, there is that hope that that when it resolves, and then their patents on the therapeutic methods they've claimed are linked to their specific psilocybin, but the patents seem to be written about psilocybin in general.
Yeah, yeah. I find it's a stretch, but I'm not an expert in that area, but I find it very, very hard to think that they're going to corner the market in such a way as to justify their market cap.
Yeah, I'd be shocked. I'd be shocked. On the other hand, what they do with the money is they can buy and do other things.
Of course. Well, while the sun shines.
Yeah.
But wait till people start to discover the real value, and I think that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, they were. Yeah, they're interested in buying a lot of other things.
Like what?
Well, I don't want
have you talked to George in the last couple of months?
Yeah, well, Katya is super mad about David Bronner challenging them, you know, and so she feels betrayed and all of that. And I'm saying, I think you should probably just put out a statement about what you're trying to do with these patents and make
Right.
it clearer what is your
Open.
real goal.
Right.
Absolutely.
You know, and then this article that was just came out criticizing synthesis. Did you see that one?
No.
No.
Okay, so there's an article by Compass funded researchers in England at King's College saying synthesis basically should be shut down, and that the whole Netherlands experiment is a risk and it should be shut down, and that, you know, medical use is, you know, going forward, and that we should wait for the research, and all these policy experiments should be shut down. That is one of the things that David Bronner was objecting to. So the arguments, though, are so fallacious, because what they're eliminating personal growth and spirituality as a motivation for doing this, and they're assuming that only people with a diagnosis are going to the Netherlands, and they're treated by people that aren't properly trained, and it's going to be a disaster. It should be shut down. So they don't account for human rights, you know, the human rights abridgment of the drug war, and they're funded by Compass. So Katya, though, is very upset that David has been, you know, criticizing them in public ways. And I keep saying, you just need to explain yourself, but they don't do that.
Right.
And I don't think that they feel that they need to do that, because they just raised all this money. What do they care about the public? They care about investors. They care about their stock price. So I don't find them to be as reaching out to the community as much as they could or should. And I do find them using traditional big pharma practices that are not unusual in big pharma.
Right.
But that's George's expertise, Rick, as you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's where what I'm really worried about is this creeping idea into even some MAPS people, like, oh, we should patent the intellectual property we have on the production of MDMA. I mean, that was really disturbing to me. I entertained it myself, like, oh my God, we're gonna have to take all these loans or whatever, and how do we pay it back? And but I really don't think that there's much protection there, and I think it goes against our approach. So we have some internal dialogues to go forward on this. But yeah, no, I think that Atai is going public. You know, there was a statement that Christian Angermeyer made about how in the end there's only going to be Atai and Compass left, because all these other companies are going to be unable to operate because Atai and Compass will have all the patents. So it talked about their aggressive patent strategy to shut other people down. It's not just about them.
Oh yeah. That's a real risk for the small fry who can't afford to fight.
Well, just this $250,000 we had to do this formal dispute resolution with them. I mean, and then you get into patent costs that could be millions of dollars. I mean,
oh my God, and that's a cost of doing business, which everybody knows. But Christian Angermeyer is funding Brian Mararescu,
which is good. Yeah, I guess for those of you who are listening, I don't want anybody to share what I'm about to share.
Please, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but never mind.
No, that's okay. No, that's good. That's good. No, I asked Christian to fund Stan Groff. You know, I said, we have an obligation to the psychedelic elders. You know, I said, Ann Chilgun and Stan Groff, these are our two elders. They're both, you know, having healthcare issues. You know, you just made hundreds of millions of dollars on Compass. It wouldn't have happened without them. So Christian actually agreed to give Stan $100,000 a year for the rest of his life.
Oh, good stuff.
Okay, but okay, so that was great. Then what happened was that he wanted Stan to be on the board of advisors. Stan said, all right, I'll be on their board of advisors. And then Stan did some advice, and he said, you know, these people are clueless. They don't know what they're doing. It's all going to be about remote monitoring of people while they're tripping, and how do we, you know, reduce the therapy costs and use digital therapeutics and all this kind of stuff. So they were concerned, but they were still advisors. Then they were asked to make promotional videos.
Right.
And Stan said, you know, I'm not going to do that. And so Stan has just left. He told him, I don't want the money. I need the money, but I don't want it. I've got to be 90 years old without compromising myself in this way. I'm not going to be your spokesperson.
Good for him.
So actually then what I've done is we've started another fundraising campaign from from other people to give money for Stan to work on the Groff Legacy Project and for Ann to work on publishing books. So we're paying them for stuff that's within our mission. And so we got one person to donate 50,000. Susan Pritzker is donating 20,000 a year to each of them. We've got some other people. So we're making some of it up.
But still.
I just
No, but that's a pay to play scheme. And that's,
I mean, George and Katja should be doing that too.
they should be saying these are the psychedelic elders that are struggling, that in an era where they didn't make money, they did it out of passion and mission. And so
George and Katja didn't know anything about this field 10 years ago, Rick. We all know that.
We were with George when he met Stan for the first time.
Of course.
Yeah, but now they feel aggrieved, like the community's against them and everybody's against them, and that they're doing God's work. And
isn't there some field of psychology known as the victim, Rick? I can't remember. I'm trying to. So much. Oh God. Well, it's all very interesting, and I have a feeling the strength of this community is intense. I was so interested in those three presenters and the idea of collaboration.
Miles, thanks for still
Miles,
being
that
on.
was great.
Yeah. Hey guys, happy to be here.
Yeah. So
Miles,
Miles,
I couldn't leave.
Yeah, Miles, do you want to talk about that the article?
Yeah, let me take off this headset. Yeah, we had been like, can everyone still hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. We had been warned that was coming out, and I think we had there was like a little mini coalition of people preparing to like how we might respond to it. I think ultimately like it wasn't as attacking as we had thought it might be from what we had been hearing, but ultimately like where we stand on it is that knowing that we're not an organization that could even remotely pretend to kind of go up against Compass in any way, we really want to focus on staying in our lane and showcasing really good work and not being reactive and responsive, because that's a battle that we don't think we would win and would really tire us out. Yeah, so really like what we've been asked to respond to a couple response articles. I think there's one coming out in Chacruna to that article. And really our stance is like medicinal work with psychedelics, traditional, modern medicinal work with psychedelics, and psychedelic retreats have very different goals and outcomes, and there's space for both. So we really want to focus the conversation on making sure that both are safe and accessible and done really well, as opposed to saying that one's better than the other or one needs to be focused on rather than another. So,
well, how do you address their critique though that people with mental illnesses will come to the retreats, and that the retreat context is not sufficiently supportive, or the people aren't sufficiently credentialed?
Yeah, I think that's a big question, and I was being involved here in Oregon as well, where I'm currently residing. It's one of the bigger questions on everyone's mind, exactly to what you pointed out earlier, Rick. We have a pretty rigorous medical screening. Like we estimate that a reverse analysis of all the costs and resources we put into screening people, we pay about 300 euros per person to screen them, and over half of them get rejected because we are being very careful with who we accept. Like anyone who's been diagnosed, anyone who's on antidepressants, anyone who has a history of trauma that we don't feel like we can support in our container. However, I shared this with the group earlier when I was answering the Q&A, is that we know that these experiences really unearth levels of trauma that people don't even realize they have, let alone if they're trying to lie and get through our screening system. And so, we really just focus on doing the best we can to build that container as if it's a trauma container. There's going to be 10 to 20% of people in a group that have very challenging experiences that need additional hands-on support, even though about 80% of them are going to be, okay, this is at least our experience from doing the 50 groups and the 750 clients that we had before COVID. And so, yeah, I think it's to what you said as well, Rick, is it's not, we're not intentionally advertising to or accepting people who have trauma, and that's just creating a certain container, and how we want to show up is really thinking beyond diagnosis, treatment, and a longer tail of how to integrate these experiences into your life and incorporate ritual and ceremony in a way that you kind of embrace the mystery and kind of, longer tail of things. So yeah, it's a tough one. I think that Oregon is going to be a really interesting ground where, at least from what the feeling of people here on the ground is, that Compass won't have a lot of leverage to mess around with Oregon because it's a state community driven measure. However, we know that there's going to be a lot of really important decisions to be made on who can access, under what supervision and what dosages, all these questions that really haven't been answered yet in a societal regulatory level that will need to be answered in the next couple of years before Oregon turns services on for the first time.
Well, I've arranged for Tom Eckert to speak with Tom Insel and Paul Summergrad and Graham Boyd also, so that they will have these discussions. And I think this two-tiered argument makes sense about it, that for those people that have a diagnosis, then they get routed to people in Oregon that have got the proper credentials. And then those people that personal growth, spiritual, they don't have to have people that are licensed to do therapy. I think that would address the concerns. And
it's something we've been exploring in the Netherlands as well. There's it's like we're being so careful and slow about how we approach this, but I think you might know Roz Watts is now part of our team.
Yeah.
So we're looking at how can we use the existing infrastructure in the Dutch system to provide psychiatric care and support as like a full, imagine like a synthesis psychiatry department that refers people to retreats and provides before and after care for retreats that is fully paid by Dutch national healthcare insurance. And so,
that's national health insurance.
And there's already apparently, from what we're learning, huge shortage of just regular psychiatry services in the Netherlands. There's like 3 to 5 month wait lists for anyone getting any type of care. And so we're exploring a way where we might be able to refer those people into our wellness container, ensuring that they have a certain amount of support before and after, and kind of like sign off from a psychiatrist saying that they can come.
The one part that I think is worth saying is that we're sort of buying into the idea that credentials equal, talent and experience and quality and provision of this therapy, but I don't think that's the case. So it could very well be that your people are just as well or better trained than licensed therapists to provide it even to people with mental health conditions.
Yeah, I don't know if we would say that on the record, but we do get a lot of feedback from clients who come. And even our exploration calls are these like 45-minute intake calls. They're not very intentionally not meant to be sales calls. It's really meant to talk to someone about why they want to come and ultimately support them in making their own decision. But we get feedback on those calls that those are more powerful than a lot of people's therapy sessions. And it's really this really compassionate approach that we try to take. And just being like space holders in the truest sense of the form all the time. And so, it's a good point.
I guess I would encourage you to say that stuff on the record also. You don't have to make it like a hard thing, but just say that a lot of your, but I think it's good to enter that thought into people's minds, that it's not just that credentials equal quality care. Yeah,
good point.
Yeah, there's no risk doing that, I don't think. That sounds...
No, I think if anything, just being mindful about not trying to point fingers at others. It's true. It's an important narrative to be weaving into this whole discussion. That credentials don't equal. And in a lot of ways, I forgot who I was talking to recently that said this, but in a lot of ways, over-credentialing might be particularly unuseful to being a psychedelic facilitator, because there's a lot of unlearning that will have to happen about how to hold psychedelic space. So can't wait till society gets to a place where we can have that discussion.
That's what Michael Midhover says a lot, is that a lot of training is people to unlearn what they've been doing.
Right.
So Miles, I was going to apply. I'm an attorney, and I was going to apply to the CIIS to be a therapist. And I said, but Janice, I don't have a background in psychology. She said, you're so lucky. I mean, she said it tongue in cheek, but there was a sense of you have a lot, you don't have to do as much unlearning as others. But I do want to ask you a question as a board member for BPRG, and that is, we're trying to figure out where we're going to be when we grow up, and trying to figure out where we should have focus for speakers where should we put our emphasis in terms of, the affinity groups. So these kinds of conversations lead to more conversations, which is really good. But if you have thoughts on that, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm hoping that one of our next events will be a presentation about what's going on in Oregon. I think it's really important for us all to hear about that, the process, but we'll keep you posted.
Yeah, there's some hesitation about the decrim movement and, as a 501c3 and how much we can advocate in this kind of stuff. And my position has always been, we are an educational platform.
Yeah.
We'd be crazy not to be talking about this. It's going to change the landscape materially. And one of the thoughts we have, obviously, is how do therapists deal with clients who are taking these substances in decrim cities and then coming for an experience or at least integration. And it's a wide open area, obviously.
Yeah, I think the rules on lobbying from a 501c3 are pretty narrow, so that you have to be working on changing a particular law. So that if you're commenting on a law, you're not working to pass the law. There should be no problem whatsoever. I think your educational approach is totally right.
Exactly.
That's where we are right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Luckily, we have a good lawyer on our team.
Who's learning in real time.
Who's pro bono?
All pro bono.
Yeah.
Good food though, Rick. Good food.
All right.
All right, guys.
Great. Yeah, I think we're going to have to close the room, but thank you,
all.
everyone. This is
Bye, everybody.
Well, great to meet you. Our son was a Northeastern guy.
Yeah, we love Northeastern Miles.
Yeah.
So
So
Well, thanks for letting me in.
yeah, we look forward to more.
really a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.